streaming. Let's see what we got here. Bad. It says bad. Hey, James.
Yeah.
So, we have two different computers.
Okay.
Everything's blazing fast on the internet. Something is up with YouTube. I don't know what it is. It's saying just bad speed. The only thing I can think of is I don't know why this is happening. Maybe this will get fixed shortly. To like, just what kind of webcam it, like use the computer and stream for the moment, because this is like not even like our stuff is working and the speed of the place is working super fast, but I don't know why this is a YouTube thing where it's saying bad and we don't know why. This is like out of our control.
I would just go choppy.
Just go choppy.
And hope it speeds up.
There's no other. It has to be YouTube, right? I mean, there's no other.
Yeah, it has to be.
It's not Facebook.
It has to be YouTube. Yeah.
Okay.
What is it saying?
It's just saying stream stat is bad, like they're not receiving data fast, but we're getting blazing fast speed, and their speed's super fast. And we have two computers we tried it on.
Yeah.
So it's like, I just don't know what's up with YouTube right now and why it's doing that. Never had this happen. Yesterday it said good.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm gonna keep trying it. But
yeah. Okay.
Sorry. An idea. Literally, I have no idea. The mouse is good. Where's mine? Yes.
Just to let you know, I had it playing and I heard the copies. It looked good, it sounded good.
Oh, cool.
So, I mean, I'm not sure if it's maybe something on there that's sure why it's poor, but from what I saw from Problem X Buyers, it looked
Yeah. Oh.
I saw people walking in front of it. There was
And it wasn't choppy?
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
So, just to let you know.
All right. Thank you. Well, now it's just good. And now it's working. We should just pop. I'm afraid to. I wonder if we should pop it all to your computer then.
Keep it on the other one.
Do you mind for now?
Yeah, I
We're
don't
on
mind.
time crunch.
Yeah.
God, I don't even know how fast I can possibly do this.
Do you want to switch over to that one?
Yeah, let me switch to this computer. You know what? Because
Dear colleagues, I'm delighted to address this important conference on the European Union and the Americas. I regret that I cannot be with you in beautiful Miami.
First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Randy Bullard. I'm the head of the corporate practice here at Greenberg Traurig. And first of all, welcome to Miami. We're very pleased to welcome the delegations from the European Union to the U.S. here for this important symposium over the next couple of days. When I looked at the program, I saw disaster recovery, resilience to democracy, human rights, and trade. And my first impression was that these were four seemingly unrelated and non-overlapping topics. But they make sense when you think about them in the context of where we are located here in Miami, at the geopolitical crossroads of the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Miami is probably one of the most important coastal cities in the United States, grappling with the effects and potential effects of long-term climate change. Rising oceans, changes in weather patterns, the unprecedented increase in the size and strength of storms and coastal flooding are problems that we will be facing over the next 30 years and face today. There are over 3 million people living in Miami-Dade County alone, and as you can see, well, as you could see 2 minutes ago, construction and migration to the area continue unimpeded. Long-term construction, urban planning, and environmental sustainability are a necessary part of this equation. Miami is also home to one of the largest immigrant communities in the United States, fleeing poverty, corruption, violent oppression, and lack of freedom throughout authoritarian regimes and failed states, too many to mention in these brief remarks. Trade, our port was visible outside the windows just a few minutes ago, and our airport over that way are the gateway to the United States and a gateway to Latin America for all sorts, types, and sizes of trade and commerce. Global trade and free movements of goods and people across borders benefits everyone, no matter what is said on Twitter or CNN. Again, I don't want to take too much of your time other than to say welcome and to introduce our opening speaker, Caroline Vicini. Caroline took up the position as deputy head of the EU delegation in Washington in September 2015. She has a long and storied history in the diplomatic corps on behalf of Sweden in various capacities since 2004. She has a master's degree in business administration from the School of Economics at Gothenburg University in Sweden, and I'm sure you'll find her remarks very interesting. Again, thank you so much for coming here. It's an honor for us to receive you.
Thank you, Randy, for those kind words, and good afternoon to everyone. As said, I'm Caroline Vicini. I'm the deputy head of the EU delegation in Washington, where we engage on a daily basis with the US administration, with Congress, with business groups, think tanks, civil society, on a whole range of policy areas. Fascinating though that is, we are very conscious that Washington is not the United States of America. It's also a part of our job to visit outside Washington, to go to other parts of the countries, to hear and see and talk with people on the ground, and to talk about what's important to us, and that is the relation with the European Union and its 28 member states. We are still 28, notwithstanding the news on Brexit that came out yesterday and today. A trip here to Florida is never a hard sell, particularly after there was sleet and rain in Washington this morning, and especially in November. It's beautiful to be here. But I'm especially pleased to be here in Miami to take things to a new level for us and kick off our first ever Europe and the Americas conference. It's been several months in the making, and as a pioneering project, it had to overcome all the hurdles that go along with doing something so big for the first time. So I would like to take a moment now to thank those who have had a hand in making this happen. And I will start with Greenberg Traurig, that have had an enormous patience with us, and also have not shared only this beautiful venue, but also a lot of their economic and political and legal insights, which was very important to us when we started to think about how to create this. I want to greet and thank the general consuls of our member states who are present here in Miami, and who fly the European Union flag alongside their own here in Florida and in the neighboring states. And it's a growing crowd, which shows the importance of Florida to Europe. We have a team from the delegation in Washington who are supported by another resource. You know who you are, and thank you to all of you because you have done a great job to make this happen. I want to thank the business community here. We have been in contact with you over the past months, and we are really looking forward to hearing your perspective on the region that is so important to both of us. And I'm happy that you will be able to share with us the awareness that you have here and the special knowledge you have here in Miami on how to work with the Caribbeans and the Latin America. And then I want to thank our friends in academia. We have long-standing relations with the universities here in Miami and in South Florida. And what they do is on a daily basis is to educate new generations about Europe, about the transatlantic relations, the importance of the transatlantic relations. So they are really working for the future, and they are very important to us. I also welcome the media who are here. We all are on social media, and that enables us all to feel like journalists a little bit. We are documenting important moments or experiences that we are having. It has its advantages, but it has also its limits. Traditional media is a necessity and an integral part of public life. As democracy around the world comes under pressure, your work has never been more important. So thank you to the media who have chosen to be here. And at last but not least, of course, our speakers, particularly those from the region and from Florida, who are joining us for this inaugural conference. You will see a little bit of me during the 2 days here because I have the role of MC. And so before turning this to the substance of this meeting, I just have a little bit of housekeeping rules to enhance your experience as a participant and also to open our deliberations here to a wider audience. First and foremost, you need to be aware of that this event is live streamed. So our discussions are fully on the record. My team here will tweet highlights from the delegation's Twitter account, which is @EU in the US. I urge you to follow that on a daily basis because then you'll know what's happening in Europe and what we are doing here. And if you are tweeting yourself, please use the hashtag EUAmericas. Second, as this is a city where people are speaking both Spanish and English to each other, we are providing simultaneous translation. Please use the headset available if you want to avail yourself of this. It has an access from Spanish to English and from English to Spanish. And please feel free to use the language that you prefer when you are asking your questions and making your comments during the sessions. And also, as we are live streaming and as we have the interpreters, you need to use the microphone when you are asking questions. So please wait for somebody to come up to you with the microphone. Third, in the folder that you've got, you will find the bios of all the speakers. And this is a number of accomplished people who will participate in leading our discussions today. We will end the day with a cocktail and some music, and that's a chance for you to come up to the speakers and get to know them even better than you can do through their bios. And finally, I want tell you that you might be contacted by our team afterwards because we would really appreciate your feedback. As I said, this is a first for us and doing something outside the Washington reality that we know very well. Here, there is another reality, and we would be more than happy to get your feedback. So please try to respond to that if you can. And it's also an opportunity to us to continue the conversations with you because we would like this to have a follow-up, that it's not a one-day firework here, but that it's something that we can build upon, and that our colleagues at the consulates here, with whom we are in contact regularly, that they can also benefit from in their daily work. So why are we here now and to have this conference? Last week, as you might have noticed in the media, leaders from around the world gathered in Paris for the solemn ceremonies to commemorate the end of World War I. It was an important moment, coming a year after the 70th anniversary of NATO and the 60th anniversary of the European Union. When we were sort of revisiting the ground where so much blood was spilled and lives lost in 2 world wars, including people from America, soldiers from America, of course, and I'm sure many Floridians, it helps us to better understand why the European Union exists and why EU member countries believe we have perhaps found the only durable way to ensure lasting peace and prosperity. That is a perspective that often gets lost when we start to talk about trade and other things, but the EU is actually a peace project. By integrating our market economies in a vast single market, by consciously creating common interest and acting as one in matters of trade, we have created an area of peace and stability, of which we are very proud. And it has given us the longest period of peace in our history. And that has also been hugely positive for the United States. Transatlantic relations are under the spotlight, however, mainly because of tensions between the European Union and the United States over trade, over foreign policy issues like Iran, over how to help the EU to become a more effective defense and security actor, and how to tackle global challenges like climate change and migration. Let me be clear that the EU-US economic relationship is second to none. The statistics are very well known. We are your most important trade partner, and we are your most important investor, and millions of Americans and Europeans depend on this relationship for their daily work. In fact, as the EU Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström, who was in Washington yesterday for a meeting with the US administration, and for now she tells us that our bilateral trade relations are on a slightly more positive track. But with the escalations in tariffs and protectionist rhetoric, the multilateral trading system is under pressure. And tomorrow you will hear from the EU Ambassador to the United States, David O'Sullivan, who is a former EU trade negotiator, some of the highlights of our relationship and the need to manage these frictions to ensure continued growth, economic opportunity, and prosperity. But the transatlantic, of course, covers a much bigger area than Europe and the United States. The Atlantic also joins or separates, depending on how you look at it, Europe from the North and South America. In our bilateral work here in the United States, we don't always emphasize the fact that the EU is a strategic partner for all of the Americas, including Canada and the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. We'll make up for that today and tomorrow. Miami was the obvious place to start this conversation, thanks to its place as a major hub for US-Latin America trade, its closeness to the Caribbean, its vibrant business groups, diaspora communities, strong European presence, growing diplomatic representation, and world-class universities. What we hope to get across in the coming days is how European Union is modernizing its relation with Latin America and the Caribbean. The EU is also a top investor there, and we have trade agreements in place with 26 out of the 33 countries in the LAC region. I leave it for Ambassador Sullivan tomorrow to talk about that dimension, including how the newly minted USMCA is viewed by the EU and what it might mean for us. The EU and Latin America are linked by history. We share a past, but also a vision of the future. While the EU has built stronger ties to Latin America through trade, aid, and development, This conference is timed to coincidence with the new release of a new strategy setting from the EU on the relation with Latin America and the Caribbean. And that strategy will recognize that the nature of our partnership is changing because our continents are changing. It will move beyond the ideas of donor-recipient relationship, and it will instead support innovation, creativity, and high-quality education. It's updating our political relations with Latin America and the Caribbean to encompass inclusiveness, sustainable economic growth, and security for its citizens, but also against organized crime. It will emphasize disaster prevention and management and human rights, democracy, and governance. So we have chosen 3 teams for this conference. One is climate change, disaster preparedness, response, and resilience. And we all see before our eyes how the climate is changing in Latin America. Precipitation patterns are shifting, temperatures are rising, and some areas are experiencing change in frequency and severity of weather extremes, such as heavy rains. And I don't think anybody knows better the effects of climate change than the people of Florida and Miami. Then we will move on to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We have seen recent developments in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Brazil that are evidence of a recent weakening of democracy and the rule of law in Latin America, which is bucking earlier positive trends. According to the OECD's Latin America Economic Outlook for 2018, 3 out of 4 Latin Americans have very low confidence in institutions and show little or no confidence in their national governments. 80% think that corruption is affecting the quality of democracy, and that figure has raised significantly during the last decade. Latin American democracy is a bit fragile and is at risk of further weakening. Economic integration is the last theme, and there the World Bank is suggesting that deeper economic integration among Latin American and Caribbean nations is vital if the region is to become more competitive and to boost long-term growth. Although the region actually has pursued this since the 60s, the level of inter-regional exports are only around 20%. In the EU, which is highly integrated, we have a 60% interregional trade. And as you will hear tomorrow, that we suggest that as a win-win solution for both economic and political transformation of the region. Clearly, this is a time of great challenges, but also of great opportunities for the region and its partners. So our hope is that we can come up and look at some ideas that can inspire policymakers to further unlock the potential of Latin America and the Caribbean. So now it's coming to an end, and we will soon kick off with a video message from Christos Stylianides, who is the EU Commissioner for responsible for humanitarian aid and emergency response. And then we will move on to the first panel on the theme of climate change. But the most important note before that is that we invite you all to remain at 5 p.m. when we will have cocktails and music, and we will have a chance to get to know each other better. Tomorrow, for those who are interested to come back, we will resume after breakfast at 8:30 with welcoming remarks by Antonio Peña from the Greenberg Traurig, and he's also, as you all know, president of the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce. And then we'll have a guest from Brussels, Edita Erda, who is the managing director for the Americas for the European Union, and she will talk about our new strategy. And then in the afternoon, as I've said before, we will have economic and trade integration. So I wish you all once again welcome, and I introduce the video message.
Just before that, we have...
Yeah, oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Here is some mistake in my documents. Of course, we are very happy to have actually a local representative of the city of Miami Beach. So Kirsten Rosen Gonzalez will give us who is the commissioner, one of the commissioners there, will give us a sort of real local welcome, not only Florida, but Miami Beach itself. Welcome up, Kirsten.
Well, I wasn't really preparing to say anything. I had registered for the conference because I'm very interested in cultural educational diplomacy, and then I received a phone call saying, well, would you speak at the conference? So here I am. I'm very happy to be here. Bienvenidos a Miami Beach. Welcome. As you can see, we are one of the most beautiful cities in the world. We are also at sea level. So we live this every single day. It started a couple of years ago, I believe 2015, when an article came out that said, 2013, an article came out saying, goodbye, Miami. Nobody had ever even heard of sea level rise. So we are exploring it right now. It's an existential challenge for all of us. We have billions and billions of dollars in real estate, and the interesting thing about climate change and sea level rise and resiliency is that it's not a risk factor. It's a constant, and it's always going to be with us year after year, and nobody ever wants to think of their home disappearing. So we're faced with these challenges. I don't know how much you know about our local government and how it's organized, but we have municipal governments, city governments, a county government, a state government, and of course the federal government. And we have such a large bureaucracy and so many different agencies working together that sometimes it's not the most efficient. And yet we really do need to work on efficiency. Right now at the local level, what you can see is we are bonding hundreds of millions of dollars in local infrastructure work. We have not really gotten help yet from the county or the state level. We're spending money on our own. In the city of Miami Beach, where I'm a commissioner, we have spent a couple of $100 million so far updating our infrastructure for sea level rise. And it's been very interesting because it is trial and error. Sometimes you will complete a very expensive project, $30 million, $50 million, and the outcome won't be what you expected. And as an elected official, you can imagine it becomes very easy to criticize this work. So it's been very difficult, and what we're learning so far is the one way that we can counteract sea level rise, because we're built on porous ground, is literally to raise everything. But when you go into a neighborhood and you say to people, okay, well, we're going to come in and we're going to raise the street higher than your home, what do you think the reaction is from everybody else? So as we build, it's very, very difficult. And the only way right now that we've figured out how to remove the water from the streets when we do begin to flood is to put it into this beautiful Biscayne Bay. But as you can see, that the bay, the way that our ecosystem works is that the water really filters down through coral rock and it cleans itself that way. So if we remove water from the streets and we inject it into the bay, we've seen a negative effect on the bay. So we are constantly working at this. We just bonded an additional $400 million just in the city of Miami Beach alone. It passed this past week, and the city of Miami is spending $400 million. So you're talking about local municipalities and taxpayers financing almost $1 billion of infrastructure work. We haven't had any help so far. And the reason that we're doing this is because obviously our bond ratings are going to be impacted by this. So we have to show that we're working on all of this infrastructure work. So it's been a huge challenge for us. We're rising to the challenge, but when we get these types of reports, like the UN report that came out last month that said we have 12 years to shift all of our infrastructure, it becomes very depressing as you're driving in your vehicle and pulling up to put gas in the tank, and you really do feel a little bit of desperation. Obviously, at the national level, the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement was terrible for us here in South Florida, who are facing, this existential crisis. So none of this has been easy, and also, there's an economic impact right now because we're in the process of redrawing our FEMA federal flood maps. Now, something very interesting happened when Donald Trump got elected. They were in the process of redrawing these maps, which were going to show us that the entire region was in a flood zone. But because he owns Mar-a-Lago and a lot of valuable real estate, all of a sudden that program was unfunded. So they have stopped temporarily the redrawing of these maps. But when these maps are redrawn, we are going to see that we are all in a flood zone, and the federal flood insurance program that we have right now is in debt. $20 billion. So if we go into a regular business market and we stop the federal subsidized funding for this, what we're going to see is an incredible increase in flood insurance for mortgages. So we're doing this work. We are buoying the flood insurance system, but we're going to have to do incredible work with the federal banking system, insurance, and these are all challenges moving forward. Imagine being an elected official and having to face all of these crises put together. You know, it's not an easy time to represent a community that could, you know, potentially be going underwater. And at the same time, we see these hurricanes that come into the region, and then we have mass migration from Puerto Rico and other communities that are affected. So we are going to have to absorb all of these immigrants that we wouldn't normally have to. So we know all of these things, and we have serious challenges moving forward. In terms of human rights, I said that I just barely prepared some remarks on the way here, so it's very, in terms of human rights, we just had our midterm elections, as you can see, about a week ago. We are in a recount right now. We are in a highly bipartisan environment here in the state of Florida. One thing is not partisan, though, and that is the reform of our criminal justice system. As you know, we have more people incarcerated than any place else in the world. And in the state of Florida, we passed an interesting referendum. All of our vote in the state of Florida, when you went to jail and you served your time, when you got out, you did not get your voting rights back. So last week, we restored the voting rights to 1.5 million Floridians, people who had not been whole. They are now made whole. This was a huge accomplishment, and I think you are going to see that this is a trend moving forward, and we are very proud of that. And that was not it was not something that legislatures put on the ballot. It was a private initiative of people who went out and got 1 million signatures to put this on the ballot, and then it passed overwhelmingly. So, let me see. As you said, we are in the most peaceful time in our world, but we also have experienced some hate crimes recently, especially anti-Semitism. Our local communities, we're working on security. One of our largest problems here, as you know, is gun violence. Our knee-jerk reaction to gun violence and all the deaths that we've been having has been to put police in the schools. But what we do know is that we have a larger issue that we're facing across the United States, which is mental health, and we're going to need to address that. And then, of course, immigration. We really do need to work toward immigration reform, especially here locally. There's always a question, are we a sanctuary city? We have hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants who work here. They really do buoy our economy. We don't know exactly what's happening with this migrant caravan that's coming toward us, but it's been a very horrible time for places like us, because when we have an administration that creates a lot of fear and insecurity, we have a population that, that goes into hiding. And we don't want that to happen, because we need to continue to educate these people, these immigrants. We want them to come forward and pay their taxes. And there are so many people in temporary protection status right now that are very fearful of coming forward, because they realize that that when they do, they could be detained or taken into custody. So we don't want to operate in this climate of fear. And so it's not easy being an elected official in Miami-Dade County in 2018, but we are very optimistic, and we're working as hard as we can to create all sorts of solutions. And climate change is a global issue, and hopefully we will eventually rejoin the Paris Agreement. And I'm so happy that the European Union is here creating these experiences for educational, cultural diplomacy. And welcome. I hope you go out, enjoy our city. Definitely come to the city of Miami Beach. We have one of the most beautiful beaches you've ever seen. And thank you for the opportunity to welcome all of you. Here, thank you.
So now we're going across the Atlantic because Christos Stylianides, who is the EU's Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management, so he has a truly global task, and as you might know, the EU and its member states is the world's largest donor. We are engaged all over the world. He has held this position since 2014, and that has coincided with some of the biggest challenges facing the European Union. And that is linked, those are of course linked to the instability around our part. The screens for you.
Dear colleagues, I'm delighted to address this important conference on the European Union and the Americas. I regret that I cannot be with you in beautiful Miami. This conference is a great opportunity to stress the importance of our relationship between Europe and the Americas, to evaluate the state of play and identify ways to enhance our partnership. I'm a strong believer in our transatlantic bond, and the reason is simple. Europe and the Americans share so much: history, values, and of course interests. Our partnership benefits the world in so many ways, and I believe we can work even more closely together, bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally, because today's challenges know no borders. Therefore, our partnerships should not be limited by borders either. This is especially true when it comes to fighting
As you heard, I am the Caribbean Haiti correspondent for the Miami Herald, and I'm also kind of like the disaster reporter because prior to the earthquake, I've covered my share of hurricanes in the Caribbean over the years, including Ivan in the Cayman Islands and Jamaica, Matthew, and last year I went with the UN Secretary General to Barbuda and Dominica, and I was just one of 2 journalists that he invited with him to go on that trip because he really wanted to drive home the message about climate change and resiliency. So I'm really excited, and I'm going to introduce our speakers today, and I would like to have them come up. And we're just going to have a conversation. And what we'll do is, before the time is up, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, and hopefully you guys have a lot of questions, or there's something that one of the speakers say that you really want to get a little bit more elaboration. And each one of them will basically give a 2 to 3 minute introduction, and I'm just going to do a brief, bio. First we have, and excuse me if I mispronounce your names, Pierre Delson, Deputy Director General for Space Policy, Directorate General for the Internal Market Industry Entrepreneurship and SMEs, European Commission. Then we have Omar Abu Samra, Director of Preparedness, American Red Cross. Senator Carmelo Rios Santiago, President, National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators and Majority Leader, Puerto Rico Senate. Okay. And Frank Royaso, Director of the Office of Emergency Management, Miami-Dade Fire Rescue Department. Start, Frank, if you want to start off with 2 to 3 minutes.
Are we on? Are we on? We're on. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invite to come here and address you. It's sort of how this happened is I signed up to sit in your seats, and then I got a call would I come be on a panel. So let's talk about a couple of things when we talk about emergency management. Emergency management, depending on where you are in the United States with emergency management, you have different priorities that you face. Right now in California, obviously with the wildfires that are going on, that's their topic of the day. And when you get in the Midwest, we're dealing with floods and tornadoes. And when you get over to our side, we're hurricane oriented. And part of that mindset that those of us that are in this business get into is that we don't look at things a little more globally as to the different types of disasters that we face. And times are changing. And here in South Florida, we have a nuclear power plant, Turkey Point, and that's one of the issues that we would deal with should we have some type of catastrophic failure, which is very unlikely to happen, but we don't think about that much because we don't have the occurrences that happen with Turkey Point. But there's a couple other issues besides hurricanes that are now coming to the forefront globally, and that's dealing with these terrorist attacks that are now happening, multiple shooters, single shooters, that type of thing. The dangers of biohazards being released. Here in Dade County and Broward County, there are samples taken every day and analyzed every day in different spots of the county in Dade and Broward to look and see what's in the air, just seeing what's going on. And so we need to get out of the mindset that when we're emergency management in Miami-Dade County, we're worried about hurricanes. And it's a real threat, and we've sort of gotten in a groove now that we know they're coming, and they're coming more frequently, and they're coming more intense, and it's having an impact on us. It's having an economic impact on us. It's starting to have an impact on mortgages. It's starting to have an impact on insurance. It's having an impact on young people trying to decide where they want to set their roots. Do they want to buy in this community, or do they want to rent because maybe it's a bad place to invest over a long haul? So dealing with the elements of natural disasters that we have far broader impacts than just that incident that takes place at that time. And emergency management is a piece of that. And we work under a system called NIMS that really came about after the 9/11 incident. And it's a national system that is at the federal level, the state level, the county level, and for us to be able to operate. And the way it works just basically is that we have preparation, and we have response, and we have recovery, and we have mitigation. And that's usually the order it goes in. And we need to start rethinking on the mitigation side and start putting that mitigation on the front end instead of on the back end, because we're paying $4 for every dollar we could pay if we did some stuff on the front end. And I think something that's going to help us is this Disaster Recovery Act that was just signed into law by the president that's going to open up a lot of money for mitigation on the front end, which should in turn help us with the resiliency issue of us surviving the long haul. So with those remarks, I will stop and we'll move on to the next.
Senator Santiago.
Okay, so I'm Senator Carmelo Rios from Puerto Rico, President of the National Hispanic Caucus and Senate Majority Leader, and I'm competing against that view. So this is why I brought up these socks, so you can concentrate on the white socks that look like baseball, and kind of get attention for 3 or 4 minutes of something that has marked my island. As you all know, we had not one but 2 hurricanes. We had Irma a week before, and we had Maria. So when Irma came, we thought we were okay because we are supposed to be expert on hurricanes. We've done it 7 times. 7 times, weak success at some point. But when Maria came, for first timers like me, I'm 45, and when Hugo and George passed, I wasn't in the island, I was going to state school, so for me it was the first time. Imagine that as an elected official. So for the first time, when I saw Maria, we thought we were okay in my hometown of Guaynabo. I live right next to San Juan, which is a suburban area, kind of wealthy area, everything is okay, we thought. So as I was coming out, I want you to imagine this. Just imagine that you live in your neighborhood and you can walk 100 meters and not recognize the neighborhood you're in. I'm talking about major disaster, I'm talking about flooding. I represent 500,000 people, and I have from the very wealthy to the very poor. Most of the images that you saw on CNN and Fox were in the hometown of Cataño, which is 5 minutes away from Guaynabo. You saw people walking in water, sewer water, up to their waist. And that was only 10 minutes away from the airport. Not even talking about center of the island where we couldn't get into about 10 days later. So for us, it was a shocker as a government. We collapsed. We thought we had a plan. And when I came to the emergency center, we figured out we did not have a plan for this. And you can see some of the photos. This is September 21st. This is a community that was poor, but it was thriving. They had food. They weren't starving. And 24 hours later, they had no home. Most of the people that live in that community, which is called Las Acerolas, were homeless for 6 months. And we couldn't do nothing about it because they had no title. And FEMA won't recognize people without titles. Now, I know some of you work with FEMA, and I have some very good comments about FEMA. 48 hours after we got hit, FEMA showed up. And they said, well, let's get to work. And this is our plan. We're going to have people file their claim to the internet. And then we looked at each other and said, really? Didn't you get the memo? We have no electricity. And they say, well, no, it's going to come back soon. So I spoke to my governor, and we thought about kicking FEMA out of the island. But then we realized that we needed them. And we had to tell them we won't be with electricity for a year. So we never told people that we were going to be without electricity for a year, because just imagine that will do to a person. They said, anything you know about the way you live is no longer available, even with the help we were getting from Florida, from all over the place. And we were getting a lot of help, by the way, and thank you for that. The problem with the help was that FEMA decided that they were going to overtake the ports because they wanted to make sure that the food and the provisions that were getting to the island were falling in the proper hands. We asked who were the proper hands, and they didn't have an answer. They had the poor. I said, well, guess what? Everyone is poor now. Because even if you have money, you couldn't get food because they weren't available at the supermarkets. Because we had no drivers to come and fill the supermarkets. So we had a perfect storm. We had no electricity. We had people that needed medical care. And hospitals running on diesel and fuel they couldn't afford because they did not have a plan for an extended long period of time. So they came with the greatest idea of ever to only supply $20 of gas for the citizens. So we had the 20 and 24-hour lines and people from my staff camping outside gas stations just to get $20 of gas. As President Trump says, we live in an island. It's a small island in the middle of the ocean, and it's a big ocean. So we couldn't drive to Georgia. We couldn't drive to Texas. We couldn't drive to Oklahoma. We could only survive. And that was our deal. So after the first 72 hours of chaos that carry on for the next 3 weeks of chaos, we had some plan to restore hospitals first, make sure people that were sick could actually get some medical attention, and then something happened. And this is where you guys from the European Union come in. I got a call from a senator from Chicago, Senator Iris Martinez. She happens to be a very good friend of mine, and she's the DNC chair at the national level for the Hispanics. And she called me up on a SOS because she was stranded in San Martin. I happen to know the owner of that hotel because I recommended her 2 years ago that go to that hotel. They will take care of you. They were stranded after Irma and Maria, and they got hit hard. So when I thought I was going to be a simple operation of getting a friend out of an island, I hit a wall. We couldn't go there and rescue Iris and about 350 U.S. citizens that were stranded in that hotel because we had no memo of understanding with France and the Dutch government. So we had the planes, because we did have the planes, and we had to call the Senate Majority Leader, actually from the U.S. Senate Majority Leader, to call the Pentagon, the White House, to get approval and talk to your government to go and rescue 350 U.S. citizens. After we did all that for 72 hours, and we had our planes fly to San Martin, and almost illegally, because we had no agreement, it wasn't 350. It was 3,000. So Puerto Rico, who was stranded at the time, had to rescue 3,000 human beings, cannot invade a country, and take them to the U.S. soil so they can be taken care of. And this is where I come into this gathering. We need to come together, and I think living in the Caribbean, where you have a Dutch government from Holland, a French government, and we all get hit by the same storms, hurricanes. We need to come together and have an understanding of what we can do for each other just in case this happens again, because it will happen. And I know I don't want to be that long, but I just want to close out with this. Global warming is a reality. It's here. It's not coming. It's already here. If many of you have seen the movie, which I think all have, Pirates of the Caribbean, when Johnny Depp gets stranded as Captain Jack Sparrow in a very small island, it has only a palm tree. That was filmed in Puerto Rico. I have a photo of it right there. That's where Jack Sparrow got stranded, supposedly to die. If Jack Sparrow will come to that very same island today, it's no longer available. And that happened after Maria. So there's no sequel for Jack Sparrow to come back to the island. It's gone for good. So global warming is here to stay. As governments, as first responders, because many of you, I see your badges, Red Cross, I see a lot of people from the Copernico, I think they're in the panel. Thank you. Because government wasn't the first responders. It was community-based. While we were dealing with FEMA and all these federal things, churches, community-based organizations were the ones that really saved thousands of lives in Puerto Rico. Now, how come we as government cannot do it, community-based can? So I just leave that out there. I know we have many questions later on.
Yes.
I will talk about energy, plans, and lessons learned. Thank you.
Omar?
Excuse me. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon. My name is Omar Abu Samra. I lead our preparedness work for the American Red Cross internationally, and as part of that role, I have the pleasure to be the head of the Global Disaster Preparedness Center, which is a partnership between the American Red Cross and the IFRC, supporting preparedness activities in all 191 Red Cross and Red Crescent countries. This means that we think about preparedness not just at the local community level, but we also think about it on a global scale. Every day, we're seeing more and more extreme events happening in places at a higher frequency, and due in most parts to the effects of climate change. What it means for the Red Cross and for the communities that we serve is that we are finding that we have to have new interventions that have a more significant and faster, more broad impact to help reduce and prevent the impacts of disasters on the people that we serve. We're looking at things like the use of new technologies, the use of new approaches, working in collaboration with partners, not just doing things alone ourselves. We're trying to advocate at the national and international level to improve disaster law, to improve international disaster law, so that the interoperability when disasters happen between nations is already discussed, and it's not something that happens just in time. We work very closely with local emergency managers around the world to understand how we fit into their response systems. The Red Cross is an auxiliary to government. We are, in all cases, in every country, the Red Cross has a role to provide immediate first response. That varies from country to country. In some cases, that means we actually do search and rescue. Here in the US, we provide food and shelter and some immediate recovery items. But for the most part, our role is defined at the national level. When we talk about our engagement in the Americas, we're always thinking about how do we localize and contextualize the work, thinking about language, about access, about trends and issues that vary from country to country, and specifically thinking about how the community prioritizes their needs and how we translate those needs into action in collaboration with our partners, the Red Cross societies or the governments that we work closely with. Over the past decade, I think, you could say we've seen an increasing number of high-impact events, weather-related. We've also seen trends towards migration, different causes for that, whether it's political, economic, natural disaster. There are a lot of different reasons why we're having to not only anticipate, but adjust the way that we intervene at the local level. Without going into specific details of different disaster responses, I just want to kind of finish with this idea that the local community priorities, while unique in most circumstances, are now we're looking at them in new ways through the use of data, technology, and with partnerships with different stakeholders. We're really trying to not just connect local needs to be better prepared at the local level, but we're trying to advocate and enhance the engagement with government to the local communities through the advocacy and role of the Red Cross. So I'll pause there and just look forward to questions.
All right, Pierre? Pierre?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for having invited me. Of course, what you said is very striking, and you were in a very tragic situation. And the picture you saw about the Jack Sparrow Island, it's maybe a good illustration of the climate change. But you know, in Europe, we believe that there is a climate change, but we want also to demonstrate that there is one. And for that, we have launched a satellite program which is called Copernicus, which is basically an Earth observation system. So we have launched satellites and will continue to launch satellites actually to take pictures and to monitor the situation on Earth. And the purpose of those satellites is basically to try to see whether there is really a climate change, not only on the Jack Sparrow Island, but more generally. And so we have satellites which are there and which take pictures and monitor the situation of the seas, for instance, the sea level, the quality of the seas, the evolution, you know, the temperature of the seas. We have similar system for the land systems. And we have also pollution. And we really want also to launch new satellite to monitor CO2. And if you don't believe that there is a climate change, you should go on our website. Because those data that we are gathering are not for the Commission or not only for the EU. Actually, we are taking picture of the whole Earth. We are using those data for the whole Earth, and those data are freely accessible and available to everybody. So not only you can see the Jack Sparrow Island, but you can look actually at those data. And for instance, on pollution, we've just issued, you know, a map of the world where you see the pollution in the different cities, and you can look at the situation in Miami. And we will continue to do so. We will continue to use these instruments to provide information and to monitor the situation because we believe it's extremely important. And now, moving to what we are discussing today, which is unfortunately a situation when you have a disaster. What do we plan to do in Europe, actually? First of all, by monitoring those information and using those satellites, you can already try to anticipate and to see where actually disasters could take place. Because it does not happen like this overnight, suddenly. You can see it in advance. You can see some elements. And so we are trying to use those data and also providing those data to everybody. I want to insist on this. We want everybody, everywhere in the world, to use for free those data. That's our commitment as a European Union. We are willing that this information is shared with everybody. So first of all, you need to anticipate. You need to look at those possible disasters or possible disastrous situations and see whether something can be done. And then we have another mechanism, because unfortunately, as you described, sometimes you have hurricanes hitting an island or hitting a city or a place and so on. We have also developed a systems of emergency management system, using also the images from Copernicus. What does it mean, actually? It means actually that when a country asks us, we actually activate our satellites to monitor the situation and to see the development which are taking place and the damages which affect a country or which affect a region of the world. And we develop maps that we share with our partners. And actually, we have done so for Irma. We have done so for, more recently, we have done so for several hurricanes with the US. So we have provided our images, our expertise, and our maps to help, actually, people like you to go on the ground and to find and to help and to rescue people. Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is to rescue people and just to make sure, actually, that the damages to the extent possible will be controlled. So to come back to your plea for more cooperation, I can tell you something which is important for us as European Union. We believe in this cooperation. We believe that we need to continue. We have regular contacts with the US authorities, the US government. We share information. We have developed those satellites which are high quality. I can tell you, of course, being from the European Union, it's normal that I would tell you that they are excellent by definition, but it's true, actually. Not only do I say it, but it's true and it's confirmed by independent experts that the information that we provide is very good. And we want this information to be actually utilized and continue to be utilized in the future, because the issue of climate change is not only for Europe, it's not only for some part of the world, it's for everybody. And something which takes place in Puerto Rico, something which will take place in other parts of the world, has consequences everywhere. So we are living in the same world. We are all in the same boat. So let's try to share this information, let's try to work together, and let's try actually to develop something which is efficient and help to protect all citizens of the world. I would stop here.
Pierre, my first question actually is for you. To follow up on what you were talking about in terms of cooperation, in your opinion, what is not happening or needs to happen in order for that cooperation to be strengthened and for more areas, countries, or even local governments to take advantage of the satellite information and also the experience that Europe has to offer?
Maybe you should ask the question to others, but to other countries. First of all, I would like to say that with the US, actually, we have a good cooperation. I must be honest, we have an excellent cooperation. We work with NOAA, we work also with the State Department, and so they know that we exist, and they know that we are willing to share and to use our satellite also to monitor the situation in the US, or at least some parts of the US.
But if Miami-Dade, for instance, wanted to tap that information, would they have to go through the State Department, or can they contact you directly?
They can contact. Actually, our man, sitting behind there with the red tie. You see, look at him. He's a key person. I'm not sure you want to contact him, because if you contact him, as we were discussing before, that you have a disaster. So maybe it's not, But for the unfortunate case where you are such in a situation, Jean-Luc, who is our man in Washington, based in Washington in our delegation, is a key contact person. And so through him, actually, he can send the message to Europe, and we can activate our satellites to make sure that we monitor the situation in one particular place of the world, particular place of the US. But to come back to your question and what you raised, we need also to have more awareness within the public authorities everywhere in the world. And because not everybody is fully aware of these possibilities, not everybody is aware of what Copernicus can give and can help. Again, it's not a magic solution. Copernicus will not send a plane to help you in Puerto Rico, will not be able to provide you with food. But it will still be a very important tool for those being involved on the ground to know where to go exactly, to see exactly what is the situation. We've used Copernicus, of course, for the Caribbean. We've used it for... I don't know. That's a satellite. I don't know what it is. Yes, it's a satellite photo exactly of what. But we are doing it. We have done it also in Africa. We are doing it, of course, in Europe. We are doing it everywhere, unfortunately, where you have this kind of disasters. Now, to really respond to your questions, this kind of events, this kind of meetings are important. But we need to spread the word also within the public authorities everywhere, and that's the key. Again, we are not asking for any money. Actually, you are even paying to provide this information to the rest of the world, because at the end of the day, it's being paid by EU taxpayer money. It's that money which is involved in those programs. But again, as I say, we don't do it because we are nice people. Of course, we are nice people by definition. But the real reason why we're doing this, as I say, we live in the same world. Yeah. So what's happening in Puerto Rico will have, is an indication, is consequences elsewhere in the world.
Frank, from Jack Sparrow Island to Mexico Beach, there was this iconic photograph. I remember it being on the front page of the New York Times, of this lone blue house that was standing and that had survived the recent hurricanes. And it made me remember that oftentimes whenever these storms come up, and I'm in the Caribbean, people always talk about Miami-Dade County and building to Miami-Dade County code. Can you talk about the fallacy of that argument and how important wind loads are when we talk about disaster preparedness?
Well, we have that photo here, if they want to put it up, of that house. It's a blue house sitting on the beach. So they're flipping through to find that. I'll tell you about that blue house. The individual that owns that blue house is a person that lived in Miami-Dade County. And he moved up there and built his retirement home and insisted it be built to the wind load code of Dade County. And they tried to talk him out of that and told him, you're going to spend a lot of money that's not necessary, et cetera, et cetera. And he did, and you see the results of it right there on the screen. The building code in Florida is the same building code throughout the entire state. After Hurricane Andrew, there was a building commission that was put together, and it traveled through the entire state, and they took input from all the officials and the public and so forth and so on. And then the code was presented to the legislature, and it was approved. And for a very short period of time, we were all under the identical code. And then what happened was construction found that the cost to build to that wind load was prohibitive in some parts of the state, especially when you got to the north end. So the legislature amended the code, amended the requirements, and they put bands down along the state of Florida of what the wind load had to meet. So if you were 155 miles an hour sustained here in Dade County, you might be 95 miles an hour, 110 miles an hour up in the Pensacola area or something like that. And so they did that, and so the builders built to the code, but they only had to structurally meet the wind load for that. So they were building by the code, and the plumbing code and electrical code and that type of thing was not an issue, but it's the structural portion of that that has the hit. And now that group of legislators that were the ones in power from Andrew are gone, and the new group is in, and so we're going to revisit it again, I'm sure, and we're going to make an impact on raising that wind load. I can tell you right now the current code that they've just now adjusted has the Miami area and that band going up along the east side of the coast, and the Gulf Coast up not quite to Lake Okeechobee, is we're now looking at 180 miles an hour wind bursts of 3 seconds. So it's a big change of what the reality is. One other thing I just want to mention while I'm here is that, you know, you've all heard the saying to think globally and act locally. And I think it's really should be reversed, because the reality is we think locally, but we don't act globally with the impacts of what we do. We look at our little niche of where we sit locally, and we don't consider what the impact is outside of our immediate sphere of where we have control or interests. And I think we have to get past that, and we need to start coming together. We're all on the same blue marble, as the TV show used to be, where my kids would watch the big blue marble about the planet. And we need to start doing things in more of a unison, cooperative nature of what these impacts are, what we do. And when somebody does something that's smart, we should be including those across the country, across the world, that people look at things. And we just don't seem to have, I don't know if it's a level of cooperation or if it's communication or what it is, but we don't think that way. We think somebody from the top is going to come with some kind of a magic fix and it's going to filter down, when the reality is it's going to come from the bottom and it's going to come up. And we just need to have people that are in those positions listen to the fixes and the things that we've had to adjust to, and then apply that on a broader scale.
Senator Rios, I have a scenario for you. You've just received word that another hurricane, same intensity of a Maria, is approaching Puerto Rico. Based on your experience with Maria, what are 3 lessons learned that should be applied to be better prepared and to prevent the kind of disaster we saw in Puerto Rico?
Since I'm a survivor of 105 days without electricity, so nobody asked me for camping. I'm not coming. I already have my camping spirits. Microgrids. We, for so long, we thought we had a strong energy system, electrical. I don't know if you see one of the photos. I will probably ask for it before and after, what we look like. You'll be surprised. Talking about luminescent contamination, if you see the before and after of Puerto Rico, before we look like a star. I mean, you can see us from space, and we look like it was a big light. The after, it was dark, pitch black. So electricity will be one of the main concerns. We have come with legislation. We just approved it about 2 nights ago. By 2027, we should be carbon-free, which is kind of a crazy goal. But I think we can actually accomplish it because we have 360-something days of sun, free sun. I know it's not the only answer. We need to still, I think that's a photo. Okay, we're getting there. That's me in the water. Okay. That's before the hurricane and after. So it is crazy that that was our reality for about 8 to 10 months. And it might be fun for 30 days, but for 300 days, trust me, it gets complicated. So we have come with a new energy policy, building codes. We build in concrete. So we thought we were fine. We found the hard way, we're not fine. We still have about 20% of the population with blue tarps that are designed to last 60 days. Trust me, they last a year. I see them every day. If you were to land in Puerto Rico right now, you'll look down the plane and you'll see a very poor community that still have blue tarps. The third, it'll be, and we have come with a policy. Hospitals were shut down because they had no diesel. So we have come with legislation now that hospitals has to have at least a week supply of diesel. Because we as government, and FEMA did help a lot on this. I'll give them credit for that. Hospitals say, I don't have to buy diesel, so FEMA's gonna give it for me for free. So we're saying, good job, not again. So we're gonna emphasize those three: microgrids, renewables, new building code, and making sure that people have access to health. We didn't have 4,000 deaths. That's the truth. We didn't have 64 either. I know this was a big debate, and it got thrown into political arena, and then we had the mayor of San Juan coming with the nasty and thing. I mean, I'm not going to get into that. That's local politics. We did have over 1,000, 2,000 at least, that were related after because we had no energy. 64 did die because of the hurricane, because people didn't have access to health. Old people that needed care, they were probably going to die in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but it got fast forwarded because they had no access to proper health care. And that's why they died. So those deaths are related to the hurricanes, but it wasn't 4,000, it wasn't 10,000, it wasn't 64. It was more like 2,000. And we realize that now.
I'm going to open up for questions after this question to Omar. Omar, I spent 15 months in Haiti. And I arrived in Haiti hours after the earthquake. I was the first reporter to fly in. And I watched the international aid community fight among themselves to put their flags up. I watched the Red Cross struggle to figure out what to do. At one point, it wanted to give everyone in a camp a $50 US voucher because it had this money and it had no idea what to do with it. Because just like in Puerto Rico, there are issues in terms of land titles, and we see this throughout the Caribbean with disasters. And the Haitian earthquake was the biggest disaster that we have seen. And the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, took a huge beating as a result in terms of the number of houses that were built or were not built. So I'm curious, based on the experience you guys had in Haiti and the PR nightmare, and yet the disasters we're seeing, what are the lessons that the Red Cross has learned in terms of going into a disaster, and how do we put people back on their feet, make it resilient, and leave?
Thank you for that question. I think that it's not a secret that the Red Cross has struggled communicating the successes that we've had in Haiti. Just like we've struggled to communicate the successes that we've had in Puerto Rico. Disaster response and recovery is really complicated. And these big touchstone events are points where we, as disaster response professionals, we learn from them and we try to improve. And I don't think that anybody would stand up and say we were perfect at any point in time in the last 20 years when it comes to disaster response, going back even longer to Hurricane Andrew here in Florida. Every single major event is an opportunity to learn. And I think Frank's point earlier about taking these lessons and sharing them is a really important piece. How we share and reflect on our experiences and how we improve the interventions that we do is is a responsibility of each responding agency to share those good practice, to reflect on them, to build up the evidence in order to be better the next time around. When it comes to Haiti, for example, we've learned so much that has already fed into the way we do cash, for instance. Cash transfer programming is an important part of our service delivery now. We have much more mature systems, much more sophisticated policies in place, so that when we need to distribute resources to a community, because cash is the best way for the community to start recovering themselves, we have those tools and mechanisms to do that now.
But let me just say this. One thing I learned is that one size does not fit all. I watched the State Department literally force the Haitian president to give up on the idea of tents when he was asking for tents and saying, we need to get the economy going. Here's what we did, after the tsunami. And he knew his people, and he knew the minute I start letting people put bricks and mortar, it's never going to stop, and I'm going to get 10 cities that I can't remove. And that's exactly, what happened. And I wonder, do you think that the aid community is more open to matching their response to the local reality and what local leaders think should be the best way to go?
I can say that the Red Cross in particular is a community-driven organization as a whole. And the way that we prioritize our interventions is through a participatory process. Part of the complexity of doing that in a situation like Haiti or in Puerto Rico, where you have such an intense level of devastation, it's very difficult to really know what the community needs. And the community doesn't necessarily know what they need at the first few days after disaster. It takes the added sort of best guesses from the experts who have had countless experiences before to try to start and jumpstart decision-making in order to be to do the best that they can. That said, if Puerto Rico, if Maria happened again today, it would be a different experience. If the Haiti earthquake happened again today, it would be a different experience. We will not make the same mistakes that we've made before. And when it comes to recovery, I think this is an important lesson, is that recovery needs to start as early as possible. And for us to be thinking about, the complexities of moving product from point A to point B in order to do distributions, the complexities about, managing the infrastructure rebuild, land tenure, all of these very complex and very important issues that come up time and time again during recovery. It's really important that we empower individuals and we empower families to do the most that they can for themselves and to facilitate access, learning, and experience to other agencies and other organizations to be able to expedite that process as much as possible.
I think we have time for some quick questions.
Hello, my name's Sam Van Leer. I'm with Urban Paradise Guild. We're a Miami-based nonprofit. We normally do habitat restoration and urban agriculture, but following Hurricanes Irma and Maria, we shifted into disaster aid mode. I was asked by partners to run 2 temporary aid warehouses. In aggregate, while I was managing them, we shipped out approximately 4 million pounds of aid to Puerto Rico after Maria. However, for weeks and weeks, we were told, no, FEMA won't let anything in. The government of Puerto Rico says no. We had hundreds of pallets of aid donated by the community. People were showing up with little bags with whatever they could give, and it was beautiful. And we were managing it barely on a shoestring. But we were told this can't go out. And then finally, people were sneaking stuff in by air. I wasn't involved in that end of things, but they were sneaking it in. And people were struggling to do the best that they could. But there were no ships going to Puerto Rico, and it was killing us because that heavy stuff, you can't ship it all by air. A pallet of water weighs about a metric ton. So what's going to be different next time? And I'm going to ask that of FEMA, of you, Senator, because there is going to be a next time, whether it's to Puerto Rico or elsewhere. How is it going to be different?
Well, first of all, because it's already expired, I was involved in the air trafficking thing. Because I had planes that I received at the airport that was for civilians, and I was taking stuff out of the airplanes. Because FEMA wanted to accuse me because I took a couple of containers. I said, I'm going to take them out of my community. And they said, if you do that, we're going to throw you in jail. I said, be my guest, I'll be a hero. And they did follow me with the National Guard, make sure that we took the food out. And then they realized there's people out there that need food. So it won't happen again. And the reason why, because we learned. We learned that we have to have a plan. And FEMA learned that they need the local government to work together. Because at the beginning was we're taking over. And they said, okay, that's you guys. Where are you going to go next? They didn't know. Community-based organizations like Red Cross, Salvation Army, they knew where to go because they work every day. And I got to thank you. I cannot say thank you enough. Because first responders, it wasn't the government, it was you guys. And what I will do different is we didn't need water to be shipped to Puerto Rico. We needed to have the money to buy water from the water companies that we had in Puerto Rico. It'll be a lot cheaper. And when I have calls from Philadelphia, New Jersey, Jacksonville saying, we have containers of water, I said, well, we need food, not water, but I cannot say no because water is life. And we didn't want people to get discouraged. So the new protocol is we will coordinate with community base. We have an understanding now with FEMA that did not work the way they had it before. And we should be able to get 48 hours once it gets to Puerto Rico out of the ports. We learned that the hard way. We wasted millions and millions and millions of dollars of donated goods, water, that were laid down on the runway because somebody was smart enough to say, leave it out on the runway, and you know what happens with water when you leave it out on the sun rays, especially in the tropics. So it won't happen again. We have a protocol now. FEMA learned their lesson. They know without electricity, you can't have an internet web-based application. They learned that now. Thank you. And we have now something that will work. And let's hope we don't have to try it again.
Well, we are going to have to do something like this again. And one of my lessons regarding water, I tried to get them to stop asking for water. And it just became a nightmare. We had hundreds of pallets of water in Miami. However, the biggest lesson that I learned regarding water was water filtration is the key. Instead of shipping it even internally within Puerto Rico, you buy the water filtration once, you ship it to the end user, whether it's a family scale, village scale, or bigger, and then they can take care of their own business. They take care of themselves. Self-sufficiency, sustainability.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Frank Ramos. I am the president of a nonprofit, a local nonprofit named Save the Water. And as I listen to especially you that are talking about the disasters, and to Pierre talking about that we can predict all the disasters maybe 50 years from now when the weather rises or the water rises, but we know that the disasters are coming. Okay, we know they're coming. Puerto Rico and Haiti are going to be hit by disasters. The problem that I see with all this talking and planning is that we are reactive rather than proactive. We have learned a lot of lessons from the past hurricanes, and I have proposed for Haiti specifically a system to take water from both Port-au-Prince and Cap Haitian through a desalination plant and build some tanks in Haiti to have fresh water already in some concrete tanks that the hurricane is not going to take down. And as a precaution before the hurricane comes, we fill up those tanks, and after the hurricane passes, everybody will have water. But I talk into the open air. Nobody listens about being proactive. Everybody wants to do things after you are reactive, after the disaster already happened. You look for solutions, see what you're going to do. We should have water treatment equipment we manufacture water treatment equipment that fits in a container that you could drop ship anywhere in the world within a day. I've talked to governments, I've talked to everybody that I could talk to. Nobody wants to listen because nobody wants to be proactive about the problem. After the problem occurs, it's very difficult to manage it. If you have the water there already, and the filtration systems that he mentioned, you can give $50 to somebody. They can't drink $50. They need water. I don't know if I need an answer.
Well, let me comment on that a minute. I think it's something that we face that is dollar generated. It's that simple. It hasn't been popular to do mitigation ahead of the disaster. And maybe with this Disaster Recovery Reform Act that was just passed, where millions of dollars literally are going to be put at the front end, that we can start to address some of these things ahead of time. Now, whether your particular project or your idea is going to get into that mix, but I mean, just very simple things that we don't really think about, but think about in a disaster when the sewer lift stations no longer are working and people are going to the potty and flushing the toilet, okay? And then it's in the streets. So you look at all these lift stations that are throughout just Dade County that have no auxiliary power on site. And I can tell you, I was a manager of a little small village here, North Bay Village, when Irma came. And we had contracts for portable generators to go to our lift stations just for that purpose because we could not afford to put them in ahead of time permanently. It was cost prohibitive for the little village. But we had contracts to get these generators there when the event took place. And what happened? We called to get our generators, and they said, oh, they went to Harvey. All that stuff went to Texas. A lot of the stuff that we had contracts for debris removal and that type of thing ahead of time was gone because these companies are nomadic. They follow the storms. They follow the money. FEMA is going to reimburse them a certain level. They know that they're going to have income for a while with these big trucks or whatever services they offer, and so they go. And then you're fighting the battle that, you know, what do? I try to sue them to come back, and then, you know, they were there helping other people, and you're being selfish because you want it back. I mean, it's a no-win. Hopefully, with this Disaster Recovery Act, and we're looking at it now in, you know, Dade County again, as to how we can capitalize on some of this and get services and things repaired or fixed ahead of time, ahead of the curve before it comes. Your type of a project, which is, we talk about resiliency, you know, and it gets, you know, it's a buzzword now, that mitigation and resiliency get talked about being the same thing, when actually the mitigation projects is what gives you resiliency. That's the idea. You fix these things, or you improve these things, or you change how these things are installed or whatever, whether it be seawalls or pumps or whatever you do, and now you become a more resilient community. That's the tenet behind the idea of doing this. And I think FEMA is finally coming to the point, and I don't know if you saw the message that was put out by the director of FEMA, but he just said, it's insane that we're spending this money over and over and over again and rebuilding these communities in the path of what's going to come next. And when you look at Mexico Beach, when you get, I don't know if you've ever been up at that part of the state, but when you drive from Alabama down to the beach there and on the Panhandle, you drive through just miles and miles and miles of pineland woods, and that's all that's there. And then all of a sudden you come up on the beach and you're at the beach. And so what an opportunity for the government to come and move Mexico Beach inland and rebuild there. But they're already starting to rebuild right where they were. And, you know, I kind of laugh about when you go back to the early days and the Native Americans told the white man, don't build in the valley, much water come. Well, you know what? We didn't listen to what the Native Americans had to say, and we built right there, and we're still building there, and we're still rebuilding there. So we take our taxpayer dollars, the same that are for Social Security, the same that's for Medicare, the same that's for housing, the same that's for health, and we fight for those dollars to keep this insanity going and putting these things back right where they were. And I'm sure that's what's going to happen on Mexico Beach. Those that can afford it are going to go back. Those that can't will sell the land at a pittance for what it was worth, and somebody else will come and they'll build, and we'll be right back there waiting for the next one to come.
Pierre?
Certainly, I don't want to intervene in this debate, and I certainly don't have any lesson to give. But I don't fully agree with what you say. You say, we know it's coming back. No, people tend to forget. Now it's very clear. People say, you know, it's fine. But what is, and as you say, people simply just forget about it. After certain times, they forget about it, so they do the same mistake, and because it's costly if you have to have a house which is more safer in other places and so on. And so you redo it like the same time because you say, okay, I was it once, but I'm safe for the next 30 years, 40 years, which is not true. And so what is my point? We need to change this mentality. And the only way to change this mentality is to show actually that climate change is a reality. And that actually we will have more and more disasters, and those disasters will be more and more powerful, not only in this place of the world, but everywhere in the world. And if we are not able to convince actually at all levels that climate change is really something which is happening, that it's not only, to come back to your example, the Jack Sparrow Island, but it's much broader than this, that actually nowhere else in the future it will be possible to behave in the same manner. Then maybe people will do something, will try to say, let's not do the same mistake, let's learn from the past. Maybe I'm optimistic, I don't know. But if we are not able to show this, people will continue to do the same thing because it's cheaper, it's easier, you have done it in the past, anyway I was it, and it will not be happen again for many years before, which is not true. And so we need to show this, we need to show that things are different. I'm European, Belgian, French-speaking, as you can hear. But, if you look, for instance, in Europe, we didn't have hurricanes now, but we had in the south of France, in the north of Italy, now we had actually flooding, and we have a lot of people dying simply because they were close to a river. And, with the flood, with the water, they were flooded, and they were, in a small village in the south of France, in September, October, when normally the weather is nice, they were killed. You have tens of people dying like this. So we need, but again, those people probably, not them, but other people will build a house in the same place. So we really need to convince people climate change will make things different for all of us. And we need to anticipate this, and we need to build for the future, taking that into account. If we don't have this in mind, let's forget about it.
Thank you. My name is Juan Gallardo with Colliers International. I was born and raised in Mexico, and given that this is the Americas with the EU Union, let me give a little flavor on Mexico. So, we had the earthquakes down there, and that's because Mexico City was built on a lake. So it's only logical. You probably heard about the new airport that has been canceled in Mexico because it's right where it's going to be sinking almost a foot a year. Also, I was living in Cancun when Wilma hit in 2005 before it came over here, and it really destroyed the destination for 2 years or something like that. And 45 years ago, I was in Paradise, California, spending a summer as an exchange student, and the house I was on is gone, has been burned to the ground, and everything is gone, 7,000 buildings over there. So the question, and to Frank's point, is it really climate change, or is it that we're stubborn? We know that Miami is going to have issues, and that Mexico City, we shouldn't be building there, that Northern California is going to have fires. Why do we insist in still grow there, keep on building? I'd love to hear what the panel has to say on that.
Omar?
Maybe I can start. And I think it just builds on the previous conversation. Being prepared is really difficult, and people tend to not take preparedness action. If you've just experienced a disaster or you're watching the news, you may say, oh, you know, I need to do something for myself and my family. We see that the most activity around preparedness happens when a similar event to what you might locally experience happens in some other part of the world. So an earthquake happens in Nepal, Californians start taking preparedness action, which is great. You know, and as a Red Cross, we're working to try to emphasize and reemphasize the importance of taking preparedness action and kind of trick the public into doing this, because if they're more resilient, if they've taken those steps, then they're going to be better off. But your question's really about history and culture, and I think that in many cases, people don't have roots in their communities today like they used to, and people don't know the history, the trends, the way that, you know, as the example that this community always floods, so you shouldn't build in the low-lying areas, you should build on the hillside. That type of experience and practice and history is something that, you know, whether it's economically driven or it's poor building codes, or it's just that the history's lost because of experience. You know, we have to, you know, find new ways to introduce things to the youth, to young people, so that they can learn what their grandparents knew, because over time these lessons are lost.
But Omar, is that not the role of government though, to finally take those tough decisions and to say, no, you cannot build here, you know, despite how much money you're going to get? I mean, in the Caribbean, we're dealing with this all of the time. Everybody wants that beach view, right? But we see what's happening to the beaches. But I've yet to see a Caribbean government really stand up and say to a developer, I don't care how much money you're bringing in, no, you're not going to be able to build there.
We need to have, let me just address this one piece. I think the example of Cancun is a great example. The hotel industry drives Cancun. And the investment in Cancun, tourism is really important. In order to mitigate the risk of disasters, insurance companies have been working with hotels to reinforce the coastline, building mangroves, reinforcing coastal reefs, trying to reduce the vulnerability of those communities. Each hotel has an incredible disaster mitigation plan and evacuation plan. So there is policy that can happen, but it's in combination with private sector investment, with the science, the information that comes with what's happening on the coast, in the waterways, and on land. So all of these things kind of come together, but it's not just government that's going to do it. It's the economic drivers as well that are going to make a difference. If a big building development wants to come in and it's going to bring a lot of money to a community, the government needs to stand firm and say, this is not the right place to do this. We need to do it in a safe place. And that advocacy, sometimes it's lost with the history and the experience about what happens at the community level.
Yeah, Senator Rios.
Yeah, I will answer your question real quick in less than a minute, but I'll start with a phrase. Kevin Costner made a movie say that if you build it, they will come. Field of Dreams. Pretty much happens in the economy. If you build it, somebody will come. Look at Miami. I've been coming to Miami since I was in high school, and these buildings weren't here. And there are many, many, many more to come. So you have a New York City in 20 years, New York City will look like a small community compared to Miami. Now, the question is, what do we do with a lot of people that are striving for the same goal, get a quality of life? Then Frank will have to come in and say what we do with the sewer system, what we do with the traffic. Those things that we take for granted, that they need planning. Same thing with disaster. Now we know, and it helped a lot, water filtration system. We gave about 20,000 through the island, 600 gallons each, 6,000 limit that you can actually filter. That's planning. That's mitigating. Does it solve the problem? No. So what we need to do is probably what the Red Cross is saying, what Omar is saying. And what do we take out of this conference? I mean, I know I'm thinking something. Throughout the 2 months that I almost lived out of the emergency office that the government settled, I heard about Copernico, but I never knew what they were. So probably knowing what we do is part of the solution. Now I know that if it hits again, I'm going to look what they have to say. And that wasn't available for me, and I'm fourth in command in my government. and I didn't have this information. Would it be helpful? Yeah, because I know that somebody's looking from the sky. What do I have to do? How come I didn't have the access to that information? So information is knowledge and it's power. And if I take something out of this conference, will be, okay, so I was in this conference with a great view. What do I take for my community, for my organization? What's my next step? Who do I have to call for the first 24 hours? What is my plan? How can I engage so I don't have to go through the same thing again? I see some universities around here. If you need a lab to rebuild a community, Puerto Rico is open for business. I know. And it's true. FIU, you guys do great engineering. You guys do a lot of planning and business. I don't know, a lot of universities are looking to Puerto Rico for some small communities, and they're doing plans, blueprints, solar, water. That's a lot of help because those communities cannot afford it. So maybe you can take a community, a small community, and say, I'm going to build housing for you guys that it makes sense. We'll come up with the money, but you guys come up with idea how to do it. Penn State is doing it. I know Cornell is doing it. I think UM is doing some collaboration. Florida International should step in. We have a lot of students from Puerto Rico, including my daughter, architect. So you guys can actually do a lot if you know where to go. So probably the best deal is, I'm here, I know where to go if it happens.
We have here.
No, maybe just one point. I'm sorry, I'm going to make a bit of publicity, but still. You say the information is lost. It's true, information is lost because people have no longer roots and so on. But you can find this information in another way. Again, talking about Earth observation, you have no idea of the amount of information that we can find, or where a flood is likely to take place, where a problem, the sea is likely to rise. All this information is there. It's difficult to dig in. It's difficult to have access to it because you don't even know that it exists. But the reason why I'm here, why you are here also, is to explain that we are actually providing this information to everybody. And so we need researchers, we need universities, we need governments, we need everybody to look at this information and try to take decisions on this basis. Because it's true, you no longer have people who have lived in the same place forever, and know that the flooding is likely to take place on this side of the river and so on. But you can find this in another manner. And that's now the challenge, actually, that to use this amount of information, which is coming among other things, not only, but from Earth observation, to use this information to develop policies and to try to make changes. And we are all in the same boat, as I said, but we need also to have a better exchange of information, knowing what is available, which is not always true.
Hi, Tatiana Lee, LSW Hotels. It's a fully sustainable hotel brand. The question is to Senator Rios and Frank. As we all aware that disastrous natural disasters cause so much, not just financial, but also emotional effect on people. And do you see, as you mentioned, Senator Rios, that you're building a new building code? Do you see that sustainable and more, I would say, or intelligent or smarter approach to building more resilient houses and developing sustainable structure for Puerto Rico and become again as one of top tourist destinations is in your plan? And the question to you, Frank, is Miami-Dade emergency representatives. Do you think, is there any room or any negotiation or any solid plan to make sustainable code compliance or building code for Miami in future?
So you say you're from the hotel industry, right?
Yes.
Okay. Hotels was a big issue because we had a lot of people from FEMA coming in, a lot of people to help, and we had nowhere to put them because hotels got hit hard. One of the best properties, Conquistador in Fajardo, with over 1,000 rooms, is no longer available. Actually, they're going to sell it and rebuild a new one. So when it comes to rebuilding, we are learning the quick, like I said, I mean, it's not all bad. We had that shocking experience, and if you see one of the photos that I showed, a guy running a bike in the water, he's not training for the Olympics. He used to go to from point A to point B in a bike. So even though it was 3 feet of water, he took his bike, he was riding the bike. I took that photo because he chucked me and said, what are you doing? He said, this is the way I do every day. He's been doing it for 60 years. So regardless of in his mind, he had to go to work. And he was riding a bike in the water. I mean, it's crazy, but it was happening. People were in shock. So now coming back to the hotel industry and rebuilding, one of the things that we are dealing with is how do we spread that the building code is not only in the metro area. Because one of the issues that we had on the building codes is, okay, the metro area can afford it. What about the hills? Is it going to be a different building code, like what happened in Florida? Maybe. Should it be the same? I will take this message from Frank to my government. Yes, because I know they did it and it failed. So we are learning from best practice and from other people that were trying to bend the system. So our building code, it will emphasize on hotels. We're going to be very strict, and we're going to help hotels, because now we know that if we have, and God forbid, the next disaster that we're expecting, we're not advertising it, it could be an earthquake, because we are right in the middle of the fall. If you look at Puerto Rico, it hasn't happened in 150 years, so some scientists are saying we're due for the next earthquake. So, and that one will be even worse than a hurricane, because it won't be roofs, it will be buildings that will come down. I don't know if we're ready for that. I don't think no one is, not even Mexico, that actually gets a lot of earthquakes every day. So on building codes and hotels, we're going to be I'm going to emphasize that the new hotels that we're building will probably be the shelters for first responders that come to help. We want to make sure they were available. Right now, we're back to 80% of the hotel rooms that we had. So it's a great visit, by the way. You should come and promote the economy. And people ask me, what can I do for Puerto Rico? Come and visit us. We're open again. But there's some hotels up in the hills and in Fajardo that got hit very hard. And we learned that they weren't ready for that. Please do.
And Frank, get the last question.
Real quick. You know, to me, it always seems to come down to the dollar. And I think government totally, whether it's local or state or whatever, needs to start looking at incentives to be able to have people do these things. For instance, if you're going to build a single-family home and we can talk you into putting a safe room in that home, much like out in Kansas, you go down into a cellar. I mean, they know the tornadoes are coming, you got to get below the ground. So you build a safe room in your house, and that portion of that area, we'll exempt that from taxes. We'll take that out of your square footage, and you won't pay taxes on that piece. Evacuation is not always the answer, and you run from water and you shelter from wind. And so everybody runs, and what happens, they're on the expressways and so forth, and they can't get out of here because it's the last minute. So if you can buy an electric car and you can get an incentive from the government to buy an electric car, whether it be to the leasing agency gets it, but at the end in your pocket, you put it in your pocket. Why can't we go that way with incentives to not just a LEED building that's, you know, those type of things, but safe structures or safe areas that the whole building doesn't have to be that way. For instance, we're going to enter into some negotiations with the outfit that's going to build this huge mall out on I-75. Well, you know, the population keeps growing. Where do these people go if we have to have sheltering? So why can't we negotiate something with them to where they can have a multi-use area of some sort that we can then turn into a shelter? Because we use our schools, and many of our schools are in areas that are evacuation areas. We don't have places down south that we can put people because of the storm surge that comes up. And so we're not building more new schools right now. We're refurbing a lot of schools, and we try to get the school people to say, listen, you need to bring it up to the level of being able to sustain a Category 5 storm, and the basic structure of those buildings won't do that. It's cost prohibitive. They say, well, we got to tear the building down and build a new building. So I'm saying with new construction, and the other thing you need to keep in mind is that the people that are coming in and developing these condos and high-rises, they make their money and they're gone. I mean, you know, they build to the minimum that they're required to build to. That's the bottom line. What's the ROI is how we operate. We're a capitalist society, and that's how it works. So if you give the incentives to have them put these things in, I think that is one method we could explore.
Well, I want to thank you, panelists, Frank, Senator Rios, Pierre, Omar. You guys offered a lot of food for thought. There are a lot of lessons learned and collaboration. I think one of the biggest thing I heard too is in terms of information sharing, which is always good. And so I want to thank you, and I hope you guys got something out of it.
Huge thanks to the panel. I think this was everything we hoped for and a little bit more. And I think this conversation will segue, the way you ended will segue very well into the next panel, which is really about mobilizing finances, how the insurance companies and programs works on this, and how we can rebuild. But before that, coffee break. 15 minutes, a chance also to speak with the panelists, and you are welcome back 3:45. I think we should try to sit down so we can get started. Welcome back in. Okay, I think we get started, and we hope for some further people will drop in when they have done whatever they need to do. But in the interest of time, and Jacqueline is returning here to monitor or to moderate. There's also this panel on the mobilization of resources, resilience, insurance, and rebuilding. So please, Jacqueline.
So I think this panel goes very well with the last discussions that we had, and some of you had some questions that you didn't get in, but like we did last time, we're gonna open it up for questions at the end. Just to kind of, set the tone, we've talked about disaster preparedness and recovery, and now we're gonna talk about how do you mobilize, resources against the reality. And that reality is, flood insurance, is probably going to become more expensive as it becomes more at-risk based, and a risk is growing. We've seen a lot of rain events, especially in the Caribbean, and they've turned pretty disastrous. We recently had major flooding in Trinidad and Tobago. We've seen it in Jamaica in the last couple of years. Climate science are predicting the Caribbean or for low-lying cities. So with that in mind, I want to introduce you to our group of panelists today. So we're going to start with Aba Prasad, Program Leader, Caribbean Countries World Bank, and she's been with the institution for 13 years, and she's a specialist in debt. Then we also have the Consul General of France in Miami, Clément Leclerc. He's been in this post since September 2016. As a member of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he's also been assigned to the Department of the United Nations and international organizations, and he has a master in international law. Current in 2015, and prior to that, she was with Trinidad and Tobago International Financial Center. And then we have Margarita Wells, Environment Sustainable Assistant Director of City of Miami Beach, and her experiences in environmental science, marine policy administration. And so with that, I'm going to open it up with each of the panelists. We'll give a 2 to 3 minute introduction. I'll ask some questions, and then I'll invite you to also ask your questions as well. Aba?
So first of all, a big thank you to Anil and the EUs for this invitation. From the World Bank, we are very excited to be here and for the work that we have been doing, in particular for the small states, as we call them, and the Caribbean. So I have a couple of slides, and the first slide that I wanted to show you is that we work for the Caribbean, but the Caribbean for us is a heterogeneous group of countries. So we have the white areas there is actually the sea, and the blue is the land. It sort of got reversed in the coloring. And so I thank Agnes for pointing that out to me. So in the islands that we work with, actually we have some which are really the micro-states, as we call them, the St. Martins of the world, where, at least on the Dutch side, you have 35,000 people, and it's just around 35 or 40 square miles. And for me, coming from a country like India with over 1.3 billion, it does seem something different for me and quite unique. Huh? And then we also have the commodity exporters that we work with, Trinidad, now Guyana coming up, also Dominican Republic, which is a different island for us, Jamaica, which is much bigger. So what I wanted to bring out is that it's not one Caribbean that we work with. Although people look at it as one sub-region, it's not. It's different sets of countries. We have customized solutions for them, and we work with them in a different way. So what is our framework for working in the Caribbean? We have what we call the 360-degree approach to building resilience in the Caribbean. We realized pretty early that it's not just enough to be ready for disasters or go post-disasters or think of just reconstruction or recovery. We thought of a bigger, more holistic approach to the work that we do in the Caribbean. And the reason we thought of it is because these are the islands which are caught in this vicious cycle of, debt and low growth because of a shock coming in. You think of Dominica at, a loss of 220% of your GDP in 1 year, in 1 day. I mean, it's what they built in several years was lost in a day. So because of that, our focus has been on this 360 approach. And when I say 360 approach, it's really what's the building blocks on the lower end of the slide, on the right-hand side. So we talk about macro-fiscal buffers. We talk about countries having counter-cyclical fiscal policies, building in contingency lines of credit, having financial resilience, not only through insurance, but other things like cat bonds, cat insurance, the Pacific Alliance, things like that. Like how can you get access to liquidity very quickly, and also how can you transfer the risk in case of a disaster. We talk about institutional resilience, which is very important given the somewhat capacity constraints that you have in most of these islands with very few people who can really do the task. And come a disaster, public financial management systems don't work, service delivery, which is so critical at that moment. So we talk about that, how we could improve on that. We, of course, physical resilience in terms of building back better, the good building codes, which we heard about in the first session, that's where we work on. Human resilience is very critical for us in terms of, because we are from the World Bank, so how could, most important for us as post-disaster, how to save lives. And when you talk about that, further on also, like in terms of youth, unemployment, crime, violence, how could you do things which, because we know that whenever there is a disaster, it's the poor which gets, and the vulnerable which gets the most effective. So how could we build in resilience on that? And the final one is, of course, the natural and the environmental one, which is very well known in this group here. We're working with Grenada on what we call the first lending, which is on a blue economy scale. So things like that on building in ocean resources, supporting marine ecosystems, etc. So that is our approach towards our work in the Caribbean. And finally, my last slide, I promise not to bore you more with this PowerPoint, is about the approach we have towards financial resilience. We talk of a risk layering approach. So if you look at the chart on the right-hand side of the screen, it really talks about the kind of impacts that you have. You have low impacts, low severity impact, then you have medium, and you have high. But what we feel is that we look at it in two phases, what we call risk retention, which the client or the country can retain the risk of a low severity impact, like let's say a flood. And how does the client do that? Through building in contingency reserves, through having buffers in its own budget. But when it's a high severity impact, like a Category 5 hurricane, that's something that the country cannot do. So there you need risk transfer instruments like insurance. And there I see Gillian is there, where we work with them and CRIF to help clients, because for that kind of an impact, the country does not necessarily have the buffer to escape that impact or to give money for that. You need insurance for that. So we divide this into different layers as to for what kind of an event, what sort of a financing would be more suitable. Thank you.
Council General Leclerc.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, for starting to thank the EU delegation for putting together this event that is very important, and for coming from Washington, because we are still in the hurricane season here, and they are already in the snowstorm season up there in Washington. I feel concerned by the topic of this panel in many respects, actually, at least four. The first one is that France, as you know, was the host country of the COP21 that led to the Paris Agreement, and together with our EU partners, we were extremely committed to creating the dynamic that made this agreement possible. By the way, partners from the Americas were also instrumental, like Peru, which hosted the COP20 the year before, and that was part of the Troika that steered the negotiations, played also an instrumental role. Mexico, that hosted the COP16 in Cancun, where the objective of limiting global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius was globally adopted, also played a very important role, and many others. the second respect in which I feel very concerned is that in my consular district, I have a number of islands that go all the way through the Caribbean until Puerto Rico, with the Bahamas and others. It's kind of the hurricane highway of the Northern Atlantic, and so it's something that we pay a lot of attention to in terms of the security of our nationals and our dialogue with the local emergency management authorities and our friends from the Office of Foreign Missions, of course. The third reason is that even here in Florida, when I arrived, it's my third hurricane season. When I arrived, people told me, well, once in a while a hurricane hits. The last one was Wilma in 2005. Since I've been here, every year there has been a direct hit. There was Hermine, there were Matthew in 2016, then there was Irma, not to mention Maria in the Caribbean in 2017, and this year we've just had Michael. So my personal experience, it doesn't have any statistical value, but what is that we have a direct hit every year, and what the scientists do tell us is that the conditions, the observed conditions make it statistically more likely, I mean, the increase in the frequency of extreme weather event is actually something that is scientifically established. And the last reason why I feel extremely concerned by this discussion about resilience is that France is a Caribbean country. We have 1 million nationals living in 5 French territories around the Caribbean Sea, and some of them on islands, and also in Guyana, which has our longest terrestrial border, which is actually with Brazil. And we feel extremely concerned, of course, of the environmental challenges of the region. And you mentioned Saint-Martin, as we say it, with respect to the French side. This was a huge catastrophe for the island of Saint-Martin. The insured damages reached 1.9 billion euros. So that's here too. It's more than the GDP of the island. It's the biggest ever insured event from the point of view of the Federation of the French Federation of Insurance in among the disasters that happened overseas. So these are as many reasons why this is a topic that is absolutely major for us.
Gillian?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here to chat a little bit more about the Caribbean and a little bit about Central America. So, Jacqueline this morning mentioned Hurricane Ivan. Actually, Hurricane Ivan was a category storm in 2004 that passed through the region and devastated multiple islands, and in particular Grenada and Cayman Islands. And losses associated with that event would have been just about almost 200% of the GDP. So it was following that event that members of CARICOM approached the World Bank and donors to start or implement and design a risk financing mechanism, and that was the birth of CRIF. So it really was intended to cover immediate requirements, immediate liquidity needs after a storm. We offer parametric insurance against earthquakes, tropical cyclones, excess rainfall to date, and we've been tremendously supported by the donor community. CRIF was started by support from the government of Japan, the European Union, the United States, Canada, more recently Mexico and Germany. So it is, it is a testimony of this belief in collaboration that has worked, and it is a risk pool. So our members, it's Caribbean and Central America, essentially pool risk, contribute premiums, and payouts are generated. And when we say parametric insurance, it means that the calculated payouts are based on estimated model losses. And the reason that's an important point to understand is that, if we contrast indemnity-based insurance, payouts would be, months down the line. But the need and the gap that CRIF really seeks to fill is immediate liquidity. So, we talked about many events this morning, a little bit about Haiti as well. So to date, and this is over 12 years, CRIF has paid $31 million to Haiti. And that sounds like a drop in the bucket, and it really is. But the value of it is that, Haiti was able to get that cash in its account within 14 days of the disaster. So in 2016, after Hurricane Matthew, CRIF paid out $20 million to Haiti. And, you know, the government, they were extremely grateful just to be able to have liquidity to keep the wheels turning, right? Because that's where a huge need is. And similarly, just after CRIF was started, there was a payout of about $10 million after the earthquake. Again, drop in the bucket, but absolutely necessary. So, you know, the model has worked, and we see the strength of CRIF is really the commitment of the members as a pool. And more recently, after Irma and Maria, we had 3 new countries join, not just the CARICOM countries now, but also the BVI and Montserrat. So they, you know, they are the British Overseas Territories, and also St. Martin, the Dutch Kingdom, St. Martin. And it is really a recognition of the fact that you do need a range of tools to deal with a disaster. Parametric insurance is one of them, but of course, you know, as Abha mentioned, it has to be complemented by the contingency lines and the other financing mechanisms. But again, the need for liquidity within 2 weeks of a disaster it's still, I think, the reason why governments continue to support CRIF. I think the focus really now has to be on scaling up. And what does scaling up mean? Scaling up for CRIF means being able to add new members to reduce the cost of insurance. It means adding new products. You know, we're working on products related to drought, public utilities, agricultural drought products, fisheries products, but also not on the sovereign level, because currently we offer policies to member governments. So even working on the micro level is part of our focus, but really it's about scale. And it means members have to increase coverage in order to get higher payouts. And as said this morning, it comes down to the dollar. That's absolutely correct. Because at the end of the day, governments have to select the policy conditions, which means they have to determine what risk they retain and what risk they transfer to CRIF, right? So the more they transfer, the higher the payouts will be. But, you know, when you're dealing with the reality of climate change and natural disasters, not just the tropical cyclones, but also the earthquakes, I mean, it's a really long-term harmful effect on the economies of the government. And of course, there are budgetary constraints. But, you know, I was left this morning with one sentiment from Pierre, that we live in one world. And, you know, scaling up really requires donor support. It requires, you know, working towards making something more efficient, as was said this morning, for the betterment of all, because we live in one world. And I love that concept, because it does mean that, you know, we're working towards the 2030 goals of leaving no one behind. So I guess that's what I would like to say now, and maybe in the questions, I'm happy to answer, you know, further questions. Okay, thanks.
Margarita?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to provide a local perspective to this conversation. I represent the city of Miami Beach, and the discussion that I hope to have here today is to provide an environmental perspective, an environmental planner's perspective to what Miami Beach is doing to reduce the risk of our community. But I'm also a Miami Beach resident, so I'm able to put a practical angle to this discussion, because as we're talking about things like, for example, I know we'll touch potentially in the questions on relocation. What does that mean for me as a resident? Where am I going to go if we do have to consider moving to less vulnerable communities? But I do, while that sounds very, very drastic and very scary, I do hope that I'm able to also provide a glimmer of hope in these discussions. Miami Beach is inherently vulnerable as a community. We're a barrier island in the hurricane corridor. We've got 90,000 residents, but up to 250,000 people that are in our city on a daily basis during our peak tourism seasons. We have aging infrastructure. We recently turned 100 years old, and a lot of our infrastructure hasn't been upgraded in a long period of time. We have a high groundwater table, so putting up walls is not really going to protect us from water that's coming at us from the rain, from below, from the sides. So we have a lot of challenges. And that's just talking about the environmental climate challenges, not about transportation issues, about disparity of income, some of the other things that are faced in urban communities like the whole Miami-Dade County region. But the part where the hope comes in, because I know you're waiting for that part, is that we have a lot of access to resources. So Miami Beach is a part of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact, which is the 4 Southeast Florida counties, Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, and Monroe County, joining together to make sure that we're planning collectively, that Miami Beach is not planning for one projection of sea level rise, but the adjacent county is planning for something completely different. And then also that gives us a larger and louder voice when it comes to reaching out to the state government and federal government, whether it's for technical support or for financial support. So that's one thing that I hope to touch on during our discussion. The other thing is the Miami-Dade County region recently was selected to be a part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And cities like actually Paris, Mexico City, San Francisco, we're talking about some of the largest cities, the ones that you see listed on t-shirts, because they're the most well-known cities around the world. And the greater Miami and the Beaches region was recently selected to be a part of this network. The reason why that's so important is because that gives us access to technical resources. So experts in all of the different fields that have to put their brain power together to kind of solve these generational challenges are at our disposal as part of this network. And not just that, but we can learn from some of the other cities that are dealing with similar challenges like ours. Before we were even a part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, we were actually working very closely with the Dutch to bring their engineering experts, their coastal planning experts, to give us some of their solutions to their challenges. They can't be applied here one-to-one because we have very different conditions, but it's good to start thinking outside of the box and looking at solutions that maybe we haven't thought of here in the region. And then last but not least, because I mentioned some of the region's successes and tools that we have available, but Miami Beach is also extremely lucky. I know that we're very vulnerable, but we're very fortunate that we have almost over $30 billion in taxable property value. So we have a lot of real estate that not only do we have to protect and makes the city, I guess, more on alert when it comes to a lot of these climate challenges, but it gives us the funding to be able to do something. I'm sure you've heard in the news, but we are in the process of implementing a $500 million drainage plan that's going to help us deal with waters that were coming up from the Biscayne Bay and also dealing with more intense rainfall events. So we have $500 million that our community is able to implement in sea level rise adaptation. Our community actually also in this past election just passed a $400 million general obligation bond that's going to help us raise our roads and also upgrade our neighborhoods. And as we're going through these neighborhood improvements, we're not building them the way that we've built them for many, many years. We are going through the process of looking at these sea level rise projections, determining what the life of each individual infrastructure asset looks like, and then planning for sea level rise and other climate challenges throughout that time period. And then just to conclude, we're very fortunate to also have a lot of political support locally that's allowed us to really push the envelope in the way that we're looking at these challenges. So I know the former panel was talking about the need to change land development regulations and the way that we're building here. And our elected officials have passed ordinances and policies that actually force us to be looking at the building standards that are way above what FEMA is recommending, and I'm happy to go into those details. And then one last point, I promise. We also noticed that there's a lot of foreign investment that is coming into Miami Beach, and their turnover for their return on investment is very short, so they don't have to be considering what's going to happen over the life cycle of the building. They're just worried about right now. So we noticed that the carrot approach of really doing incentives wasn't really moving the needle, and we passed a sustainable building ordinance that requires all of those buildings to build to a minimum standard of LEED Gold, or the equivalent in Living Building Challenge, because we want to make sure that we're not just thinking about the resiliency of the building, but what is its environmental impact. In the end, a lot of these climate challenges are because of the way that we've done business in the past and of not thinking sustainably. So this ordinance allows these buildings to operate with a smaller environmental footprint, leaves that investment here within our community, and should they not be able to reach that, there's actually a fee that's associated with that, where these developers have to leave behind financial investment here in the community for us to do larger community projects. So I look forward to whatever questions you have, and hopefully delving into more details on that.
All right, thank you, Margarita. Abba, I'm going to start with you, and it's actually a two-part question. Last year, after the hurricanes, especially with Dominica, we saw there was a conversation that was gaining a lot of traction, and I remember being at the United Nations, it came up, and this is about the consideration that these countries in the Caribbean are middle-income countries. So they get hit by a major hurricane, and all of a sudden they realize they have no money in the bank to even start to rebuild, even as they talk about rebuilding back better. And there's been a push and discussion about how do you get the World Bank to kind of change that definition of, what is middle income, so that they can qualify for concessional lending. So I would like if you can address that. And at the same time, I look at a country like Jamaica, which was once described as the Greece of the Caribbean. It has made a huge comeback, but it's been lucky. It hasn't gotten hit by a hurricane, but it's been hit by floods. So if you're the bank and you've invested all of this, how do you protect your investment in a place like Jamaica? What kind of insurance is there in what you guys are doing?
Thank you very much. I think both are excellent questions, and I really... So let me clarify on the bank's lending, like how do we lend? The World Bank has two windows that we have. One is what we call the IDA, which is the development assistance, which is given to low-income countries. And the other is the IBRD, which is the bank's reconstruction development, which is given to what we call the upper middle income or the high-income countries. Now, how do we classify countries? We base it on their income levels, where they are in terms of region and poverty classification. So the low-income countries are, just roughly speaking, countries which per capita income is below $1,000, say $995, right? And then you have the lower middle income and the upper middle income countries. But we also have a definition of what we call the small states. So any country with a population of less than 1.5 million gets classified as a small state by the World Bank. And small states have an exception on the lending that we have. So even if the small state, let's say, has an income per capita which is close to, say, $3,000, but it's a small state, it comes under the exception of small states, and we give them the same lending terms as we give to other low-income countries. And when I say same lending terms, these are highly concessional terms. The bank lends to most of the small states in the Caribbean. We lend for 40 years with 10 years grace period. Maturity is 40 years, 10 years grace period. After 10 years, they can pay at a rate of 2% the repayment, principal repayment, and after that 4%. And the interest rate on all this is 0.75. So it's kind of strange that this question, I'm really glad you raised it because I'd love to clarify that. In addition to that, the bank has what we call the crisis response windows. In case of any emergency, we pump in additional funds to that. We have also included pandemics and health disasters into that. So if if WHO says there's a pandemic, the crisis response window comes in. Then, of course, we work with CRIF on that. We also work very actively with the European Union. We have a lot of trust funds which are funded by the European Union, by DFID, by Germany. France comes in with technical assistance, which we provide. And there's a lot of money. In fact, the World Bank's portfolio to the Caribbean is over $2 billion. That's the portfolio we have in the Caribbean right now. In addition, we have this replenishment that takes place every 3 to 4 years. And in the last replenishment that we had for the IDA, that is for the low-income countries, we increased our lending threefold to the Caribbean countries. So just to say that we go the extra mile because of the realization that it's not always, how do you say, it's not always a budgeting issue that has led to the crisis that has happened. It's a shock, and you have to cope with that shock somehow. Having said that, which leads me to a good segue to your question on Jamaica. Jamaica was absolutely, you're right, like nobody thought this turnaround will happen. Today, Jamaica is really one of the star countries, not only in the Caribbean, a star country that we talk about when we talk about fiscal responsibility and fiscal consolidation. Jamaica today, Jamaica had a debt of around 145% of GDP 6-7 years back. Today, it's come down to below 100. Jamaica is generating a primary surplus of 6 to 7% of its GDP. That means it's generating a surplus. This whole amount that it generates, of course, goes to pay off its interest payments. But it's a fiscally very responsible and prudent country. And what does the World Bank do? World Bank, as its partner, supports it in this. And we feel that in order for Jamaica, because we realize that Jamaica does not have the fiscal room to invest in, say, resilient infrastructure, or to invest in, say, insurance, but it does have financially, it's unprotected where insurance or this resilient infrastructure may be there. So we have gone the extra step to provide them not only technical assistance, advice, but also advocacy to support them that they could issue what we call CAT bonds, in addition to the insurance that they get from CRIF, which I'm sure Gillian will tell you very nicely about. How could they enhance that coverage? How could they also issue CAT bonds? And the bank stands with the advocacy. We sensitize other partners. We're working with EU. We're working with the UN there, and Canada, DFID, et cetera, that, how can you support a country which has done well? And it's not that you have to support it always, because right now, it doesn't have the fiscal room, but it's slowly, as it goes forward, it'll have the fiscal room by which it can pay its own insurances. So Jamaica, for us, it's really a very good example of a country where you have risks, you built in your resilience, and you showed in the responsibility in terms of building in buffers. You're self-insuring yourself, your budgets, you're putting in place good counter-cyclical fiscal policies that will support your generations going forward.
One of the things that came up last year as these storms churned through the Caribbean is that a lot of individuals realized that they were underinsured. I'm from Turks and Caicos, and my niece had a house in Providenciales where she basically lost the entire roof, and when she told me what the cost was going to be to replace that roof, I said, you could buy a new house with that. And that's when she actually realized that she was underinsured. In Haiti, the experience that I've seen in covering there, where there were people who decided that the insurance rates were too high, and it was better to take their chance with a natural disaster than to pay the kind of money. So last year, Jillian, a lot of countries or inhabitants of countries woke up and decided that they too were underinsured or overpaying into CRIF. And I specifically remember the case of the Bahamas, where after they've had storms, and actually I think this was in 2017 with them, where when they received their check, people were basically calling for the Menace government to get out. And so I wanted to know if you can talk about that. And when you look at the amount that countries are paying into CRIF and what they're getting in terms of insurance, are they getting less than what they're actually putting in?
Okay, thanks for that question, because it's a good case study, and it's an interesting discussion around the business model and the need for scaling up. So in 2017, the Bahamas was affected by Irma, but not to the extent, let's say, that it would have been affected by Matthew the year before. So if you recall that map of the Caribbean, the Bahamas is very, very unique. It spans a large geographical area, but lots of tiny islands, right? So when the storms pass, sometimes it passes over just a few, and the damage and the losses would be less than if the storm like Matthew passes straight across the island. And that, when you're doing, you're working with models, you have to actually tailor your products to accommodate for that. Now, Bahamas they did not purchase insurance in 2016, but they came back into the risk pool in 2017, and we had actually split the policies, more suited to the geographical makeup of the country. Now, I mean, again, it's always dependent on what is the policy that was purchased, right? Countries tend to transfer the risk associated with high impact disasters, low frequency disasters. But again, in 2017, thankfully, it was not as severe as the year before. Case in point as to countries coming in or out or paying too much or too little. Bahamas, as we say, would have benefited from a payout of $31 million US after Matthew had they purchased insurance in that year. That would have been actually the largest payout that CRIF ever made. And I mean, when you look at the pictures of people suffering and the impacts of these disasters, it is tremendous, and you can understand why someone would pick up the news without really understanding in depth how these policies work and question it, right? But we're trying to do a lot of work with governments, and not just on our own. We're consistent with what the agencies, the IDB and the World Bank and others are doing in the region to make members more aware of how to best utilize these tools, right? So, but again, you have to think of it on a more long-term perspective. So when countries buy policies for excess rainfall, they tend to be the smaller events. So it would be events, they probably would protect themselves against events that are 1 in 5 years, whereas with tropical cyclone, they may look at 1 in 10 years. It's just as the starting point on a policy. So again, in some cases, if you were to sum the premiums and compare the payouts, they haven't reached the point where the payouts would be in excess. But then we're only here for like 12 years, right? In other cases, it certainly would have been the case where payouts could potentially be much larger.
Trinidad just got a payout for rainfall. Were they happy with their payout?
We wished that payout, and I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, so this is like it's very, very near and dear to my heart. Trinidad's payout was actually smaller than the payout the previous year, right? Smaller than the payout the previous year. 2.5 million compared to 7.7 million the previous year. Quite unfortunately, why was that the case? Because they actually bought less coverage.
So it looks like governments are kind of they're taking a gamble, right? They're looking at their budgets and they're deciding how much insurance do I need, and maybe this year I can go lower, and the next thing you know, they get hit by a disaster.
Correct. But then, overall, it is really a commitment to the risk pool, because you see there is a development gap. A country today cannot go out and purchase this kind of insurance. It is not available, right? And in cases where it might be, it's available at a much higher cost, because if you're dealing with a risk pool, you're pooling the risks of tropical cyclones, earthquakes, excess rainfall, into one pool. So you would actually be paying much less, right, than individually. But on that point of Trinidad, again, the need for expanding our products is really important, because the event that happened this year, and we are seeing more rainfall events due to climate change, events where it just rains and rains and rains for days. And again, flooding is a very different risk from rainfall, right? So we don't currently have a flood product. It's something we're working on, rainfall runoff. And again, the need to explain to members the difference between a rainfall event and a flooding event, that takes a lot of work and a lot of time. But at the end of the day, why are we seeing new members coming in? It's because there is a recognition of the need for it, but also a recognition of the need to, for it to be much larger, to have a much greater impact.
Consul General Leclerc, last year the European Union countries in the EU took a beating in terms of their response after the hurricanes. Can you talk to us about, in terms of France and insurance, you mentioned insurance, how did that fare out, and what would you say the lessons learned for Francois as a result in terms of financing, and how do you mobilize that for your territories?
Yes. First of all, I should dwell a little bit on the response. It's never fast enough. That's absolutely clear. The electricity took 6 weeks to be 100% reestablished in Saint-Martin. For water, it took several months. But we should not underestimate the scale of the disaster that we were dealing with, and the commitment of the French government has been massive. €500 million were committed immediately, 1/3 in immediate assistance, and 2/3 in reconstruction. There's a minister who's traveling to Saint-Martin every 2 months to take stock on the progress, and so this is an ongoing process. And again, it's the biggest disaster ever that was on record, according to our insurance sector. So now I think there is a consensus in the region in terms of the cost of rebuilding and the fact that it's not enough to rebuild, and we need to rebuild better. So now the question is how to mobilize resources. I think that we need to work at several levels. The first one is that as countries, as donors or providers of international development assistance, we are incorporating this in our policies. I mean, as far as France is concerned, the French Development Agency has committed 29 billion euros to climate over the next 12 years or so, and adaptation or resilience, whatever you call it, is a growing subject, and it is part of its policies to make sure that 100% of its projects in the future need to be climate compatible, and 50% of them need to have climate co-benefits. So that's a very strong policy orientation from the point of view of the national development institutions. Then, and the EU has the same kind of commitment, because Caroline mentioned it in her introduction. The EU and its members together are not only the largest provider of development assistance, but also the largest provider of climate international public assistance. Then there is also building up the consensus on the need to work on resilience, and there are a number of initiatives that are being taken in this regard. In the Caribbean, there is the Climate Smart initiative to foster public but also private initiatives in order to build better. Next year, at the Climate Summit that will take place in September, Jamaica and France actually will co-chair the finance segment of the summit. Jamaica in its capacity of chair of the CARICOM, and France will be chairing the G7 next year. So that's also something that will be incorporated into the agenda. You have also a lot of initiatives at the level of local governments. I mean, Miami Beach is very committed. The city of Miami is very committed. The mayor of Miami and the mayor of Paris and many others sit on the new Global Commission on Adaptation that was launched by former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, and Bill Gates a few weeks ago. So there are a lot of initiatives to pool forces and resources, both on the public and private sector. And I also think that the profession, the insurance sector, has seen that it is strategic for them to work on prevention and to work on how to make sure that you accompany people after a disaster, to make sure that not only they get compensation, but that also makes them more resilient in the future, because from a business point of view, it makes complete sense. Only 40% of people were insured in Saint-Martin. By now, more than 2/3 of the insurable damages have been indemnified, according to the profession. but the challenges are still continuing to, the rebuilding remains underway. And so this is a multi-actor and a multi-step process that we need to work on together.
Thank you. Margarita, I have a couple of questions for you before I open it up to the audience. Miami Beach, does the average resident, do they get it? Do they understand what's going on? And I'm curious as to how the city is paying for a lot of these mitigation efforts. Is it showing up in people's tax bills, property bills, taxes? And then the last session, there was a lot of discussion that talked about, relocation, and I'm wondering if you had some examples of cities that were relocated, after disaster.
I'll try to remember all of your questions. If
Yeah.
I forget, you
But
can
the
remind me
average
after I answer.
resident, how is Miami Beach paying for
The
it?
first question was whether our residents get it, and the answer is yes. And I think the proof of concept is the fact that our elected officials are lending support to these types of projects and policies. If our residents did not believe in these initiatives, they would not be happening. And as a public servant, I cannot enact any program, one, without funding, but two, without political support, because I serve the people of Miami Beach. So they do get it. We're very fortunate that in Miami Beach, well, fortunate and unfortunate. Unfortunate in the sense that the reason why they get it is because we were ground zero for a lot of sea level rise challenges, where we were seeing regular tidal flooding that was impacting people's abilities to get into their homes. I drive a RAV4, and my car has been flooded numerous times. And that is a reality for me, and it's a reality for many of my neighbors. I've seen people have to take off their shoes in order to get into their house and walk through floodwaters, which we know, is a public health issue. So people get it because we were dealing with a lot of these challenges. We've been very fortunate, as I mentioned, that we had an elected body that took the initiative to take all of that public momentum and start passing different policies that perhaps required tough decisions. And that is in part finding the funding for these projects. I mentioned the $500 million sea level rise adaptation program that we have. And the way that we funded that one, for example, was by raising our stormwater utility fees. These fees are charged to all of our residents on an equivalent residential unit, and I'm happy to have one of our engineers describe that concept further at another time. But it's basically a unit at which we charge the stormwater utility fee to be able to upgrade our stormwater system, as well as to be able to provide stormwater management services. And our stormwater utility fee, when I started with the city, was at about $9 per ERU. In order to fund the first $100 million of those $500 million, the stormwater utility fee was raised to about $16.67 per ERU. And then in order to fund the second $100 million, it was raised to $22.67 per ERU. So it's incremental, but that amount has allowed us to fund these first $200 million in these stormwater infrastructure upgrades. The remaining balance will come out of this general obligation bond, which I mentioned was recently passed by the voters, and that's going to come out of property taxes. So our residents know that this is something that we need to be doing, that we need to be taking action, and they've been instrumental in passing a lot of these funding mechanisms. But we're in what we're doing, we're also kind of writing the playbook for what a lot of cities that don't have that same financial capability are going to implement in their cities, and we recognize that. So we want to make sure that we're not the only community bearing the burden of kind of testing out these different concepts, and we're looking for support, and we've been fortunate through the Compact and through 100 Resilient Cities to get support from grant programs. We've gained access to a lot of grants that have allowed us to test different concepts and innovations, such as living shorelines and green infrastructure concepts, which are also a part of our program. So that's kind of the financial side of it. As far as relocation goes, we have a lot of different adaptation tools in how we're looking at our community's future. And it's really changing the way our community looks. If you've walked into our Sunset Harbor neighborhood, you'll see that our streets are now raised 2.5 feet higher than where they were in 2014. So our community is changing in how it looks aesthetically. But there's a lot of elements that we know are the core of why people move to Miami Beach. I moved to Miami Beach because it's a walkable community. So if we start raising streets and we lose that walkability, a person like me may not want to live there anymore. A lot of people move there because we have beaches, because we have a lot of nature integrated with our urban fabric. That's another element that we know we cannot lose. We have Art Deco buildings and a lot of great architecture in Miami Beach, so we have to be thinking about how historic properties are going to be impacted by climate challenges. So we start there because those are some of the challenges that we know we can tackle with all of this great brain power that we have, both locally as well as abroad in these support groups, in these different regional partnerships that we're a part of. And so the way that we look at relocation is really as a last resort. I think that there's a lot to protect in Miami Beach, whether it's financial, as I mentioned, these $30 billion in taxable property. We also have a huge tourism economy that contributes to the economy of the state, not just Miami-Dade County, but the state. And it's relevant enough that we get funding for beach renourishment and other projects like this. But it's also people's livelihoods, people's homes, places where you're talking about 90,000 residents that would have to find a different place to live. So while there are communities like, for example, in Staten Island, I know the state of New York was actually buying back properties within the floodplain area, and you have Isle Jean Georges in Louisiana that is a community of about 100 residents that are being relocated by the federal government through a $48 million HUD grant. That's not where Miami Beach is at right now because the finances make sense for us to continue to live there. We're considering it because we know we can't completely discount it as an option. But I think the way that we're trying to look at our community through our comprehensive planning is more of, okay, we've got this community here, it's already built, it's highly densified. As we're going through and redeveloping properties, can we potentially combine, densify buildings so that we're building taller buildings and opening green areas that can now absorb some of the storm water and absorb some of the storm surge? And our commission yesterday, just last night, so this is hot off the press, passed a land development change that allowed for a developer to take two properties, the height of those two properties that would be allowed separately, combine them into one building so that the remainder of that property could be built into a resilient park that can help us with stormwater management and some of these other sea level rise challenges that we're facing. So that's kind of how we're looking, is how do we change the community we have now rather than just give up on it and move somewhere else.
All right, well, thank you. So we're going to take like 2 quick questions because 2 of our panelists have flights that are waiting. And, okay, both of you guys.
My name is Joel Mintz.
1 second, Joe.
Oh, thank you.
I'll have you ask, and then after that.
Right behind me,
Right
okay.
behind
My name is Joel Mintz. I'm a law professor at Nova Southeastern University Law School in Fort Lauderdale, and my research and writing is mostly in environmental law, but also to a lesser extent and currently with regard to municipal finance. And my question is about municipal finance and specifically about a relatively new concept, an innovative kind of bond that was developed in partnership between the insurance industry and reinsurance companies, NGOs, and also various other government representatives and other people, and that's called resilience bonds. And the basic idea of that kind of bond is that municipalities will commit to building resilient infrastructure like seawalls and raising the height of roads and that kind of thing. And as a result, their insurance policies and premiums will be lowered, so they'll be paying less for insurance. That money will be, the money they save will be rebated to the municipalities, and the municipalities must use that money for resilient infrastructure. This benefits insurance companies because they perceive that there'll be less risk to them if there's better infrastructure, more resilient infrastructure, and of course it benefits local communities. So I guess my question is, I guess for Jillian and Margarito, although anyone on the panel can respond, and that is, does your organization employ this mechanism? If you are using it, how is it working? And if not, is that something you're considering?
And then I'll have Senator Monroe ask his question.
Okay.
Right
My question relates to the issue of resilience against the background of the United Nations Secretary General a few years ago saying that 30% of the aid to developing countries primarily were lost to bribery and corruption in various forms. And by the way, I should have said I'm Trevor Monroe, the Executive Director of Transparency International's chapter in Jamaica, the National Integrity Action. What's your experience in building the resilience of the public sector, politicians, regulatory agencies, and the citizens to bribery and corruption in a context where small island developing states and beyond are hungry for aid and for investment, and therefore prepared in the latter case to make concessions to transnational corporations in construction, particularly recently Chinese construction, transnational corporations, in tourism, ignoring regulatory requirements as to where hotels should be built in relation to the beaches, and generally in infrastructure, where the flooding is now massive across the region because buildings are being put in places where they ought not to, despite regulations. Question, how do you treat with building the resilience of the public sector to pressures that have to do with bribery and corruption? And the region, in the last 5 years, ministers in Trinidad and Antigua, across the region leads the world in resignations, but comes last in terms of prosecutions of persons in high places for corruption.
Thank you. So we'll have each of you guys take those last two questions.
It's a huge point, right? Now, CRIF, again, I just wanted to say, is supported by donors primarily, right? And, you know, they are extremely rigid now, at least now, extremely rigid conditions that go into that kind of financing. Government, the European Union, governments like Germany, they do require very detailed reports on how these funds are used, right? As well, I mean, the bank, and I'm sure Abba could talk more about this, but again, we are required to comply with their guidelines. Now, what we are requiring countries to do as we go further would be to do the reports on the use of payouts. And the bank, and this is, I'm just speaking really from a bit of a narrow perspective of CRIF, right? And our experience is to work, you know, in a complementary manner where the bank actually has a program that it manages as well to work with countries on how they report and to put systems in place for reporting of the use of payouts. Now, I mean, that is actually a big change because when CRIF was started, it was on a really commercial basis. Countries paid their premiums, we made payouts, they report to us generally on how you know, funds are used, but it's a different world today. And as donors put more money into CRIF, these are the conditions that are more stringent, that we have to comply with it, or else, you know, they have serious consequences, and those are now being passed on to the members. And we are really quite happy that the bank, you know, they're also doing programs to try to mitigate that risk, right? Because it's really all about making this work, and transparency, anti-corruption, all of those are huge parts of sustainability, especially when you're dealing with donors' money, which is the money of citizens, right?
Abba has to leave, but I don't know if you wanted to contribute anything to that.
Very quickly. Thank you very much. I think both of them are very, very useful questions. So in fact, first let me answer the Senator's question on the issue of transparency. And that was pretty much one of the issues that I spoke about, the 360-degree resilience that we speak about. We speak about institutional resilience. So we try both in terms of our lending arms, in terms of our advisory, in terms of technical assistance to support our client countries with better and more stronger institutions, regulations, which can back systems for public financial management, help them to understand what's the role of audits, enforce use our lending operations to ensure that clients have better reporting standards, better reporting to the parliaments, to the government, and to try to foster transparency as far as possible. But absolutely, it's a hard take, and it's not easy ever. We also have very strong fiduciary and safeguard standards that we put in place. To the extent, we also have people in the region who are located on the ground there to support clients in terms of what procurement standards should be, what fiduciary standards. And that's one of the things we face in St. Martin, because it's facing the bank for the first time, and they find the standards to be very high sometimes. So that's one thing we really work on. On your question regarding municipal financing and the bonds, I think it's a great idea. I haven't really heard of that one, but it seems similar to what we have recently done in the case of Seychelles in terms of blue bonds, or the green bonds that we issue for climate finance, wherein we support the client to issue a bond. It's at a slightly lower rate, but provided the client commits, the government commits to put that money into some kind of resilient infrastructure. So I think it's a fantastic thing, and is this kind of innovative financing, this is coming through a lot now, which can be used for much more innovation. And it's also done in the case of Grenada, where the bank has lent, and then the bank's money is utilized towards working on marine ecosystem and oceanography. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. And I hope, again, that you guys really got something out of it. Two of our members have to leave, but the others are here. So if you have questions that you didn't get to ask, I invite you to go ahead and ask them. Oh, yeah.
Can I just, one last thing, and that is to add to what you said, Counsel General, on the Adaptation Commission. Our CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, is also one of the members. And just to repeat her words, she says that we are the first generation which can do something about climate change. But she also adds that we are also the first generation which will face the consequences of this.
Yeah, we're done. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to show a film. Did you need to leave also, Julian? Or is your flight? Oh, you're good. Okay.
So we thought that we would make, before the reception, first of all, wanted to thank the panelists for this session, and I hope they will be able to stay. And we wanted to show the greeting from Commissioner Stylianides that you just saw the first little part, and now we are promised that this is going to be in its entirety, and I feel we would like to get that in. So, and then at 5 we break for the cocktail and the music. Very important.
Dear colleagues, I'm delighted to address this important conference on the European Union and the Americas. I regret that I cannot be with you in beautiful Miami. This conference is a great opportunity to stress the importance of our relationship between Europe and the Americas, to evaluate the state of play and identify ways to enhance our partnership. I'm a strong believer in our transatlantic bond, and the reason is simple. Europe and the Americans share so much: history, values, and of course, interests. Our partnership benefits the world in so many ways, and I believe we can work even more closely together, bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally, because today's challenges know no borders. Therefore, our partnerships should not be limited by borders either. This is especially true when it comes to fighting climate change, and of course its devastating consequences. No country, no region or continent can go it alone. We need a global response. Climate change, dear colleagues, is real and is not going away because of more and more natural disasters: hurricanes, droughts, floods, forest fires. In Florida, for example, you know better than most, your communities have suffered greatly from more frequent hurricanes, more frequent natural disasters. And as European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management, I too have witnessed firsthand the devastation from climate change worldwide, including in the Americas. Dear colleagues, but let me reassure you, Europe is standing by your side, ready to help with humanitarian aid, emergency funding, and civil protection support. As the West's #1 humanitarian donor, the European Union is leading by example. In the past 11 years, the European Union Civil Protection Mechanism has responded to 33 requests from 16 Latin American countries. We have deployed personnel and experts to assist national disasters management authorities. Just last year, a team of Spanish, Portuguese, and French firefighters helped fight the devastating wildfires in Chile. And the EU offered assistance during the deadly hurricanes Irma and Maria. Also, after the volcano eruption in Guatemala last June, and the earthquakes in Ecuador, Mexico, and Haiti. We have also provided emergency satellite mapping through Copernicus, our emergency management service. In fact, our American friends activated this service twice this year for Hurricanes Florence and Michael. Dear friends, and the European Union has not underestimated the humanitarian challenges in the Americas. Earlier this year, I visited Colombia, where I saw the real day-to-day benefits of our humanitarian projects in communities hit hard by violence. And I visited the border area with Venezuela at the very well-known Simón Bolívar Bridge, where the crisis in Venezuela is spilling over its borders, disrupting food supplies and much-needed healthcare. This is the everyday reality for thousands of people. And unfortunately, the human cost is tragic and immense. So the European Union is funding projects both inside Venezuela and in border regions, just to provide for the needy and alleviate the suffering of the people. Dear friends, I would like to finish with a few words about the relationship between Europe and the Americans, because I believe the values that bring us together are more important than those that divide us. So, we must defend multilateralism to preserve peace and stability and prevent chaos and disorder. We must resist the go-it-alone mentality that undermines our relationship. After all, it's in our shared interest. In a multipolar world, unilateralism can be a source of more instability, of more conflicts, of more suffering. Europe and the Americans have a shared interest in preserving and strengthening multilateralism. But I also believe we can do better to reform multilateralism, remake it for today's challenges, build new partnerships, and invest in our partnership. A robust relationship between Europe and the Americans is the best way to do the most good, especially for the world's most vulnerable. Thank you so much for your attention, and I wish you a successful conference. Thank you so much.